Yes, you read the title correctly. You don't have thoughts, you only have feelings. This is the bold paradigm argued by my guest today, Nick Shackleton Jones. He's the author of this book, How People Learn, which offers a new model of cognition and learning, which he believes, if we adopted, could massively improve performance, learning, and education. Nick is many things. He's an author, a speaker, a psychology lecturer, a philosopher, and has worked in both the corporate and academic worlds. Specifically, he's worked for places like the BBC, PA Consulting, Deloitte, and others, all in roles centered around innovation and learning. I had a lot of fun talking with him. We talk about his ideas, neuroscience, philosophy, how best to learn, consciousness and AI, and many other things as well. There's a really nice mix of practical and intellectual stuff in this conversation, so I do think there's something for everyone. So if these topics sound interesting to you, if you think you have thoughts and not just feelings, then prepare to be challenged on that. Please enjoy my conversation with Nick Shackleton Jones. I want to begin with perhaps the boldest claim that's in your book, which is to say, you don't have thoughts, what you call thinking is feeling. Could you please elaborate on what you mean by this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, first off, this is absolutely true. This is not me just being provocative for the sake of being provocative. But look, to set it in context, if you went back in history a kind of few hundred years ago and said to somebody, you don't have a soul, they would think that was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard, because their model then was that you have a body and a soul, and the soul kind of pilots the body around. And we got rid of that superstition, but we replaced it with another superstition, which is you have thoughts and you have feelings, that they are somehow distinct. Now, look, lots of people listening to this will think, well, of course I have thoughts. You know, I mean, neuroscience knows that we have thoughts.
I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I'm not denying that there are neurons firing and wiring in your brain. I'm saying that all of those are different kinds of affective response. All cognition is an affective response. All thinking is fancy feeling, if you like. And probably the most rhetorically simple way to see that is if you had travelled back a few hundred years and said to somebody, so you have a body and a soul. How about that rat over there? Does it have a body and a soul? They say, well,
edge case, yeah.
Let's not quite sure that rats have souls, you know. Yeah. But the same is true of thinking and feeling, because, you know, even respectable scientists think that there are distinct areas of the brain responsible for thinking and feeling. Rats have very similar kind of brain structures, but if you said, do you think there are distinct areas in a rat brain for thinking and feeling, then they'd be like, I don't know really. And if you want a bit more substance, because I just seem like some nutter on the internet, then people like Antonio Damasio, respected neuroscientist, wrote a book along similar lines, Descartes' Error, and an old friend of mine, Jonah Lehrer, wrote a series of books before he was obliterated from the scene, around how we actually make decisions. And effectively, and people like Mary Helen Imadimo Yang, Jaak Panksepp, effectively the thrust of it is all of those things that are happening in your brain that neuroscience kind of look at are affective responses. They're not distinct in the way that you can say, oh, some of these things over here are thoughts and some of these things over here are feelings. That's just some kind of prejudice that we owe to a horrendous tradition of rationalist philosophers who've really corrupted our idea of what's going on in our heads and taken us down a blind alley, all the way back to Plato with his chariot.
I was going to say, you've got the throning of
right,
him.
Yeah. You've got the reason takes you upwards towards heaven, and, you know, the emotions, the dark horse takes you down, you know, towards the animal side, your more baser instincts. And this awful idea and prejudice and superstition is carried all the way through to people like Daniel Dennett, who thinks that your brain can be kind of catalogued as an algorithm uploaded to the cloud, you know, this kind of spiritual.
Musk and other folks want to try and do that at some point.
It's just completely wrong. Yeah.
So, okay, let's step back. So firstly, you write all about this in your book, How People Learn, and you begin with a quote from Nietzsche, which is, thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, and simpler. It sounds like, well, from reading a book, Nietzsche had a better notion or more accurate notion of what the neuroscience is telling us today. Is that part of the reason why you resonate with his thinking so much on this?
Yeah. I mean, at university, I studied continental philosophy, so Nietzsche and Heidegger.
Yeah,
the good
the good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was out here thinking about verification, falsification. Yeah, you were master morality.
No, I did that as well because I was fortunate. I did some of my study in the US, which was very logical positivist in direction. We were actually studying AI back in the day as part of the curriculum. But in the UK where I studied, it was continental. So I saw the two extremes. And people like Deleuze and Guattari and continental philosophers as well. But I think one of the interesting things, we can talk more about Nietzsche if it's interesting, but is a lot of his work, he was intending it to be understood literally. And it's often taken metaphorically, and I think he realizes that in his work, and he has a lot of fun with it. So another example is the eternal recurrence. The eternal recurrence is not a thought experiment. I think he is saying literally, you live your life exactly as it is over and over again. And so I guess the seed of the idea was certainly there in Nietzsche.
I bring that up because it's not as though there haven't been dissenters from the Platonic rationalist paradigm.
Yeah, you're right.
So someone listening to this will probably push back, and if they hear, okay, I don't have thoughts, I only have emotions, or I have affective responses.
Yeah.
They might say, well, I might concede that if I feel a certain way, that contains cognitive content. If I feel fear, shall we say, a dog barking at me, within that is this notion of this is a threat to my well-being, I should get away. But probably the criticism that you hear immediately, and I'm sure you have a good response to, is what emotions or affective responses am I experiencing when I do 2 + 2 = 4? What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a common challenge, but the important thing is, so people are fond of Kahneman as an example, and so I'm going to explain this because I think it helps to
system 1 and 2.
Yeah, system 1 and 2. And the idea is that this is the evolution of this sort of thinking and feeling idea.
Yeah.
That somehow system 1 is the emotional side, and effectively Kahneman, it's a step in the right direction because he's kind of saying, look, a lot more of what's going on in our brain is actually instinctive, is emotional, and it's doing this massively complex processing that is largely unconscious.
Yep.
And then he's like, but then he goes back to the Cartesian model. He's like, but we've got this little prefrontal cortex which kind of sits on the top and moderates it with rational thought. It doesn't. Just stop, even just introspection, just stop for a second and think about a donut. It's like you've got the instinctive side of you, which is like, well, I would really like to eat that donut. And then you've got your prefrontal cortex, which is hypothetical and says, yeah, but imagine how guilty you're going to feel later, or imagine how you're going to look on holiday on the beach. These are not rational oppositions. These are hypothetical emotions set against your immediate emotions. So you can imagine system 1, system 2, if you like. They're both emotional systems. One says, this is what I immediately instinctively want, if you like. That's the animalistic side. And the other says, but you can project your emotions into different states. How will you feel? What will so-and-so say? And this is clearly not calculus. But you ask about numbers, and people generally do. And the answer to that is human beings, first off, are very poor at processing numbers. If you compare a human just to a simple calculator, and that's partly because we process everything effectively. And the second thing I would say about that is, you have a different feeling about different numbers. If I say, how do you feel about the number 18? You probably have a sort of feeling, a raw feeling, which you struggle to put into words about the number of 18, which is very different to the number 7124. But if 7124 was your passcode for something, you'd be like, this is astonishing. How did you know? And this is why we take autistic savants, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. They don't attach the same emotional significance to social stimuli, which, if you like, gives them a lot of emotional points to spend on other kinds of stimuli, and it gives them abilities which seem almost superhuman to us, because they will tell you this, they feel differently about different numbers. Different numbers have a different character. They can tell you what this number feels like if it were a person. And this is where synesthesia comes from as well. So yes, we process numbers with feelings. You have feelings about everything. You said earlier, dog barking. But the point I would like to make about that is that the emotional reaction you have to the barking is one emotional reaction, but the word dog is also an emotional reaction. All your words are feeling words. It's that,
So I think the example you give in the book is you encounter a dog in the street, and you say the way in which you respond to that is going to be based off of your previous experiences with dogs.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of separation between, say, a computer processing it and a human processing that sentence.
Yeah.
But I want to go back on those 2 points. So firstly, on the think rationally thing, this is a really amazing insight, which is if someone says, think rationally, how are you going to feel having this donut? Really, that's an appeal, as you say, to how you're going to feel in the future. It's an emotional appeal just projected out over time. If someone says, be logical about this, what follows generally from a statement like that is to act in a way that is against your long-term best interests will cause you harm. You should feel badly about that, and that imagining feeling badly in the future should be enough to deter you from this act right now.
Yeah.
So, as you say, the think rationally or think logically is kind of a misnomer, because you're really just saying consider the future emotional states you will, or affective states you will experience.
Yes, it is. It is that, but it's also something more surreptitious, more subversive, which is because we have celebrated reason, through history from Plato all the way through Descartes to the common day with people like Dennett. It's also some sort of a jibe. What people are saying when they say think reasonably is for a certain group of people, and often that's people like us, kind of well-educated, intellectuals, often in the majority. Yeah. We pride ourselves on being reasonable. So this is a horrible thing, because you see it in business often, and it's become part of the male-female stereotype as well. That, males are, no, we need to be rational, we need to be reasonable about this. And what often people mean is not just the point you made, which is, let's project into the future of the company what this means, blah, blah, blah. But it's like we need to posture as rational. We need to, present what we're saying as if it were dispassionate. Well, we didn't want to do it, but it just has to be done for the good of the company. And I think that is also been quite a toxic thread through kind of philosophy, this posturing as rational. Wittgenstein, is a great example of that. All this, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this.
Yeah, man.
All this bullshit in the early days with the kind of the Tractatus, was kind of posturing as rational. For why? Because he was a big family, and he wanted to be seen by his parents as a genius. And he knew that the way, and this is still true today, to be perceived as a genius is to be, as logical and as rational, as possible. Prove some mathematical theorem, then people will celebrate you as a genius. And so that's exactly what he did. And he wrote a whole load of crap in that book, which he subsequently kind of recanted and said, well, it doesn't actually work. I mean, it sounds good. People are looking at me like I'm a genius, but it actually doesn't tell us or correspond to the way the world is. So, I think there's a few interesting angles on how rationality is used, within that emotional, affective space, I guess.
I think when you talk about the masculine and feminine thing, I think it was Aristotle who claimed that women had, in the chariot example, their emotion, the horse that was emotion, was larger than their male counterparts, which is one of the reasons why they shouldn't be taken as seriously in politics. Whereas Plato, his whole shtick was, well, when women do mathematics, they arrive at the same solutions that men do. Therefore, they have equal access to the world of the forms and the rational and all that sort of stuff. All this to say that, yes, this notion of upholding rationality as inherently better, this misnomer that A, rational thinking separate from emotions exists, B, if it did exist, it would be better, as, obviously been out there. It's at the foundation of Western philosophy, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so I guess you see a lot of people driving around in a car with sort of rationality plastered all over it, and the bodywork looks rational. But what I'm saying is, if you ever lift the hood, you'll find it's all emotion kind of under the hood. So
I find this just on a personal level, which is whenever I encounter someone who says, "Oh, I'm not a very emotional person," I typically will discover that they are actually deeply emotional, or driven by, not to use necessarily fanciful language, but demons, problems, traumas, past affectations that they're not necessarily always aware of, or things that they try to bury. My favorite example is Dr. House in the TV series, where he comes across as this brilliant diagnostician. That's always thinking logically. Everyone lies. He doesn't want to speak to patients necessarily if he doesn't need to. He's a deeply emotional character. He's the biggest emotional character of the entire series. The entire series are people basically dealing with his outbursts and modulating around themselves. And yet, even within the show, he talks about this rational thinking and basically getting to the root. Anyway. You see what I mean?
I completely see what you mean. So I think this so much of philosophy, and it's a great shame, is driven by people's. It's like, why don't you just go to therapy? I could have run a marathon or written a philosophical treatise instead of going to therapy. And it's like they're sort of working through their problems. This is why Nietzsche, who I should say, in case I'm starting to sound like a Nietzsche fanboy, has said some grossly misogynistic things in his work. But he says, what if truth be a woman in the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil? And the point that he makes is basically, and he uses these kind of expressions like clumsy attempts of by philosophers to, the expression he uses kind of win a wench. He's basically saying they were no good. They're incels in a way. They're no good. They were no good with women, so they turned to this kind of strategy of post-rationalizing everything and trying to bend the world into a different shape, a shape that made sense in the absence of having like a good relationship as a foundation. And I'm not saying that that's universally true, but I think you often, the more you read a philosopher, you see their shortcomings hidden. It's not even like they're reflected; they're hidden. They're deliberately hidden. Like if you read Grayling's biography of Descartes, it becomes quite clear he was a really disturbed and disturbing person. That his whole beast machine hypothesis, and I talk about this and how people learn, may have just been a reason, an excuse to torture animals, which is classic psychopathic behavior. And even his colleagues who supported him intellectually were shocked by some of the things that he was doing. And that just vanishes. Do you see what I mean? Beneath the surface of the philosophy, it's like, oh yeah, Cartesian coordinates, and this is the thinking of a psychopath. But I wanted to return to something, because there will still be this lingering concern that, are you saying that 2 + 2 = 4 is just a sentiment and is equally valid as 2 + 2 = 5? And I'm not. I'm saying that there are features of the real world which exist regardless of whether or not, if you like, human beings are around. You can get pigeons to peck, for example, in a logical order. You can train pigeons so that they peck 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever on 3.141592 in a certain order. That doesn't make them logical or rational. It's just that an emotional system that we have can be induced through education and so on to behave in a way which is consistent with relationships which exist in the real world.
Yeah, consistent enough for reality to survive or for whatever purpose. I want to, again, there's so many things I want to ask you about, so I'll touch on that in a moment. Just on the last point of post hoc rationalization from emotions, I feel the same way about Stoicism, in that when you look at the time in which Stoicism became popular, you saw the collapse of the Roman Empire, you saw lots of times of famine and disease, and what emerges? This philosophy of the only thing I'm going to value are my own actions, my thoughts, my words. I cannot control the outside world, so I'm going to put the locus of my emotional well-being entirely within myself. That's kind of interesting that emerges there. And you see a resurgence of it today. Again, economic hardship, loneliness, all these other sort of big world movements of which individual people have very little steer. This philosophy of Stoicism now becomes attractive. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think often, I know there's people are big fans of Stoicism. I think Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and you use the word control. And I think there is this appetite for control in people at various times, of various reasons, and it's a way of redirecting that control and saying, well, you can't control all of these things, but you can at least control, But the question beneath that is, where does that desire for control come from? And are you happy that you've just expressed that now into the entirety of your thinking and your life?
Yeah, and the there's so many levels of that, or the idea of if you place value on the actions or words of others, that could cause you pain. Why is that bad? Why is it so bad to be affected by other people's actions or opinions? At times, that's quite important. I sometimes find when reading Aurelius's Meditations, it's so stricken with melancholy and loneliness, that writing, and you see him reminding himself, I need to focus on this, and I can only control myself, and it just seems like the rationalizations or reassurances of a man who's deeply sad and didn't have the wherewithal, the apparatus intellectually, otherwise, not saying he was dumb, but there was no concept of the time of let's unpack this. But
I think at the risk of grossly oversimplifying it. Philosophers often are overthinkers. They're often introverted. I think probably you and I are, and
Definitely.
you struggle with that on a personal level, which is it is harder for us to kind of enjoy and just kind of live in the moment. But that doesn't mean that the answer is to turn your back on it. And this is essentially Nietzsche's point. It's like you still have to find a way to have fun and party, you know. But I was that kind of awkward teenager who didn't, you know, it's
like green, a meme. Never again.
Yes. Stand in the corner and but I have intellectual thoughts. You know, it's like
these people running about their lives with no depth.
Yes.
Socrates dissatisfied. That's what I am.
I may not have a girlfriend, but I have a relationship with truth.
Yes. That sustains me far more than a human touch ever could.
Yeah, exactly.
No, completely. Well, and you see that even with comedians. I think there's a line from Jimmy Carr where he says, which one of your parents was depressed when you ask a comedian, because that explains why they're funny. Who did you have to what piece did you have to bring to the house? There was sort of an evolutionary pressure, if you like, that necessitated building up this internal apparatus. On the savant point of how you said these people probably have a few more, if you like, emotional points to spend to feel affected by numbers in different ways. Firstly, you get that even with neurotypical people. There's, I think, a phenomenon called the lucky number 7, whereby if you ask people what their favorite number is, most people will say 7, which is totally rational. In Chinese, I think there's a superstition around the number 8 because the way you pronounce it also sounds like death. I cannot pronounce it, so I'm not going to try, but I believe that's there. And when you speak to memory champions, they say ways in which to memorize a deck of cards. Apparently, a common technique is to associate each of the 52 deck with either a celebrity or a person you know, and then invent some sort of story, which is obviously emotionally affecting, in which to then store that memory. So even people whose professions are all around exemplifying memory sort of lean into this emotional paradigm.
I used to do that. Not with cards, but because I was a psychology lecturer, and because I'm somewhere on the spectrum, I was terrible with names, just dreadful with social information generally. And I would have every year, as you do, like 100 new students. I'd have, 4 classes of 20 students. And I thought, well, if I know about memory, I should be able to solve that problem. And there is a way to solve it, and I still do it today, which is very similar to what you describe. You create an image as bizarre as possible. And why bizarre? Because the more bizarre it is, the stronger the emotional reactions you have. So in your case, Jack, I would picture you, let's say, with a Jack in the box, winding the handle until this thing, jumps up.
Scares me.
And there's a lot of emotions associated with that. Humans are good at storing that kind of information. So when I see you, I see the image, and the image cues the name. And I could quite easily do that with 100 students if I put my mind to it. But if I don't make the effort, then I can't remember any of the names. So,
I don't have the excuse of being on the spectrum. I'm just not very intelligent. I started to do something so well.
Modesty. I too am extraordinarily modest.
No, it's the truth. It's just the truth. Hard evidence, mate. I'd cite it, but I can't remember it. So this paradigm you have, which a lot of modern neuroscience supports, of the thought-emotion distinction is a myth. We have affectations, some of which, they contain cognitive content. 2 + 2 = 4 is a way of mapping, shall we say, our affectations to more closely resemble physical reality. That's how people develop, say, like gut instincts around things. Physicists, scientists often develop emotional intuitions, of which they then explore and experiment. So all of that. From this seems to emerge the affective context model, affective context model. When did you arrive at this, and how does this change the way we should go about learning?
Probably during the time, I'm pretty sure it was during the time I was working at the BBC. And it was because I was reading people like Damasio and Jonah Lehrer, and I was trying to figure out why we don't understand learning. And this is true in a kind of very literal sense, which is at the time, the internet was kind of being born, and we were working on instructional design, and I was an ex-psychology lecturer. So my wizard wheeze was, if we put all of this theory, Vygotsky, Bruner, Piaget, and more recent kind of people, into practice in these e-learning modules, that these would be super mega learning, and they would be so much more efficient. And you know how that story plays out. People hate e-learning. They still hate e-learning, and that's just weird, isn't it? Because e-learning constantly tries to apply instructional design principles based on learning theory, and actually people actively avoid it. And they were at the time, and they still today, they will prefer formats like Google or YouTube or TikTok, which have no instructional design whatsoever in them. And I tested this experimentally, and actually the instructional design doesn't improve learning. For people who are motivated to learn about something, if your dishwasher breaks down, you can Google the answer. You don't want a 20-minute e-learning module, you just want the text. And when people are motivated to learn, they will pull the information that they need. And by and large, this is what drives our learning. And so I was at the same time reading accounts of neuroscientists, explanations of what's really going on in the brain, and just sort of piecing together this mystery of why it is that we have this patchwork of really wrong ideas about learning. Like behaviorists, fine, it kind of works, but you can't explain observational learning. And why are some things a reward and other things a punishment?
Without it being circular of it's rewarding because it's rewarding.
Yeah. But ultimately, that's an important point. Behaviorism requires an affective model to make any sense. It's the things that you like. Even who was it? Memories are made of this. The sea slug, Eplisia, it can be conditioned with electric shocks. And the point is, the word pain is used in that video. So even at the very most basic level of conditioning, you need this concept that there's a stimulus that makes you feel bad and a stimulus that makes you feel good. And so that's the dirty secret of, I guess, kind of behaviorism. But there's all these kind of different theories about observational learning, levels of processing. And I was trying to find a way to put them all together into a model which explained what we actually see when we look at people learning. And animals learning, frankly. And the affective context arose out of that.
So in the definitions you have, you say the old definitions, and I think I've written these down relatively accurate. So typically in most dictionaries, as a definition for memory, you'll have something like the faculty by which the mind stores information, and for learning, knowledge/skill acquired by instructional study. And the definitions you put forward are that learning is a change in behavior or capability due to memory, and memory is the encoding of an effective response to an experience which allows the experience to be reconstructed.
Yeah.
So from this, it's not as simple as make learning fun or that emotions are important to learning.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally that the way in which you are going to retain information is by reconstructing the emotions/affectations you had at the time of you were meant to be learning or being educated at the relevant time you need it. That's probably quite a clunky way of saying it, but is that a fair summation?
It is fair. And to say the same thing in a slightly different way, as you move as you move around the world,
very nice of you.
You're experiencing different things, and everything, all of the light and the sound, whatever, there has to be a common coding mechanism. There has to be, in the same way in computers, it's ones and zeros. What is the common encoding mechanism? So people like my late friend, Professor Roger Schank, were investigating this, early on with his restaurant scripts, and they were thinking, well, it might be semantics and all this kind of stuff, but rats don't have semantics. So how are rats encoding things? All you saying was supernatural. No.
Yeah.
So it needs to be a common, and the answer is everything that you experience gets translated into your emotional responses. And that's all that you store as you're moving around the world. So if you're walking along the street out here and, somebody's lowering a grand piano out of the window and it falls and it drops on somebody, you will remember that. There'll be shock and whatever. But as people like Elizabeth Loftus showed, your reconstruction, all memories reconstructive, will be inaccurate in a number of key respects. So it's not that you don't have a photographic memory. It's your encoding your emotional responses to things, and you use those to reconstruct what happened. That's why memory is always inaccurate, even in people who supposedly have photographic memories. They just have much more sensitivity to visual stimuli. So this is what I'm saying, is that everything is passed through that lens in the same way that the visual system, visual cortex, takes all of the different wavelengths of light, and it kind of reacts to different wavelengths, and you then store the emotions that come from those reactions. So it goes through these kinds of filters, and this, I guess I'm saying rhetorically, we know this as people, that if I were to ask you about your life and what you remember, it would be the emotional events, not necessarily the grand piano being dropped on somebody, but even a comment that really hurt you or struck you as inspirational or changed the course of your life. These are the things that make us who we are. We are, as I say in the book, crafted with care. We become the sum of our reactions to things. That's what we value. Our values determine our reactions. The example, and I'll start rabbiting on in a bit, but the example I like to use in the book is, if you and a friend are sitting on a train side by side, and you care about plants and they care about architecture, then you remember completely different things because you reacted to different things. You were like, oh, did you see that amazing kind of Roman arch? And I'd be like, no, I didn't see anything. But did you see the incidence of Dutch elm disease along the way? No, I didn't see anything. Like, so yeah.
Well, firstly, ramble at your leisure. That's the whole point of this. But the line in your book which struck me and leads on from everything you just said, which is to point out that, and I remember sitting with it when I read it, school, all this time that we spend in a system which is purportedly to help us learn and retain information, we remember very little that we were taught at a time where supposedly neuroscience tells us we're at our greatest neuroplasticity and all of that. Most people walk out of school with, say, a smattering of maybe a quote or two from English, a phrase or two from French, a distaste of calculus and differentiation. And yet the things that we actually remember from that point of our lives are the significant emotional things that happened to us. A breakup, the time we didn't make the football team, the time we won the final match at the football match, or what have you. And isn't that interesting? And it's part of how you lead in the book into your criticism of the education system from this paradigm, which is you say, hey, hang on, we're spending hours and hours on all these resources at time which is literally meant to get information in your brain, and none of it sticks. Isn't that worth thinking about? And
I mean, COVID was good for learning, because people weren't wasting so much time in school. They could actually go and learn things like TikTok, where what the difference was, they were learning things that they cared about, which is why TikTok's addictive. It's a learning tool. You learn about what's cool, what's not, and you not necessarily the things that the authority would like you to learn, which is why people see it as a waste of time. But this is not just a rant. There was a guy called Eric Mazur, who was a professor, I think, of physics, and he did this really interesting thing, which is he became deeply suspicious of lectures, and so he did a bunch of studies of their effectiveness and found that he said they were so ineffective that they were unethical. And this is why students, quite rightly, don't show up to lectures, because they know it's a game, and they know it's a kind of a pointless game. And the reason it's a pointless game is, and because I was a psychology lecturer, people come up to a class, they come to a lecture or a class, and they take notes, right? Why are they taking notes? Well, they're creating a resource so they don't have to remember. And if you actually test students as they come out of the class, they remember next to nothing of what they heard in that lecture. But the good news is they've scribbled it all down in their notes, and then they take those notes away and they use that in the weeks coming up to the exam to cram. For the exam, and they passed the exam. Well, hey, you've got a certificate. And then Mazur tested, I think, on a physics degree, and found that within a couple of weeks, their knowledge had returned to a baseline. Before they actually did the 2-3 years of study. It's like, wow, that's incredible. It was an incredible waste of time. And why did you do that? Because actually, and it's becoming even more a problem. I did a thing on adolescence, and one of the things that Netflix series exposed was the sheer horror of schools. And it's become, there's more and more tension in schools, because back in my day, and I'm an old geezer, predated
20 years ago,
20 years ago, then your life was pretty boring outside of the classroom. So it's like, what are you going to do? Go and ride a bike? Okay, fine. Or whatever. And then you'd go in the classroom, and okay, it was a bit boring, wasn't a big difference. But now for kids, they're saturated with all of this kind of excitement and stimulation for marketing purposes, admittedly. And then they're expected to sit in a classroom and just shut up and listen to somebody. And it's just not going to work. Not only is it massively inefficient, it's also increasingly dysfunctional. So yeah,
and a system that was built 1800s, so to deal with kids of factory workers and all of that.
Yes, it's based on the Prussian system, which was basically a brainwashing regime, which in turn was based on the religious ritual, which was, we got all these people together in a room. What are we going to do with them? Well, what do they do in church? Well, they just preach a book at them. Okay, let's do that. And it's
So I think most people would agree that education needs reform, whether it's from AI systems and as you say, there's this recognition among the university students. That a lot of people are now very critical of university education as a whole, thinking that it's a scam and not worth the money. And that's partly because of, as you say, people don't really pay attention to lectures you cram, get a certificate, and that's allegedly meant to help your job prospects. And the fact that now more and more people are going to university, there's degrees are less valuable. It's unclear what skills you get. There's lots of entrepreneur types out there who are saying, look, if you want to be a graphic designer, just go into graphic design, don't get a degree, waste of time, get loads of debt and all that sort of stuff. So I think even people from the old paradigm would concede that we need to do something different about education as a whole. In your book, and from what you said there, in terms of learning and information retention, I agree. Kids who watch TikTok or play video games for hours on end or binge watch Netflix, if we would say from a very computational lens, look at how much information they are, for lack of a better word, downloading, that's probably going to be higher than if they were sitting in school all day. But one of the purposes of education is probably, even it's a critic today would say, is to brainwash. It is to socialize. It is to produce some sort of uniformity of behavior within society. The idea that Nietzsche has around mass morality, slave morality. Is there a sense in which you see that as necessary? Because let's say we want to go watch a movie in a cinema, which is a shared space with everyone. That experience relies upon some level of socialization from everyone to essentially sit down and be quiet. And to a certain extent, school offers that. Now, maybe a much better way of doing that isn't through the schooling system, but do you think that that's an important role school plays, or that it's not working, or what are your opinions on that? Because Nietzsche would probably say he's anti being slave morality, or having someone thrust their values upon you. He's very pro go out and explore your values. But it's always struck me when reading him that it'd be incredibly maybe interesting but dangerous world if everyone pursued their own values at the same time.
Super interesting thing. So first off, let's look at both sides of that. So first off, school is a system of torture on a scale that makes the Spanish Inquisition look like a picnic, because it really is suffering. And I mean, people like
that's why there's so many dramas about it and TV shows. That's why they're all based in schools. It's always bad.
That's right. And Sir Ken Robinson, people love that TED talk he did, schools kill creativity. Should we change it? No, we're happy with the creativity being killed, because let's be honest, how many creatives do we need? But the point is, it's not just killing creativity, it's killing those kids' personality. It's taking away a big part of who they are. And what it does primarily is it teaches you to sit down, shut up, and do as you're told. And the argument you're making is, I think, legitimate to some extent, which is certainly there was a time, certainly in the industrial era, when that's exactly what businesses needed. So it served the needs of business for a compliant workforce. Now, I'm not just some bloke who wrote a book. I also actually did real things in the real world. And I used to run a service line in a big consulting firm. And I have lots to say about consulting, but we used to hire the best of the best from the educational system. They were people with, first class degrees in, art history or something ridiculous. And we would set them to work, doing stuff for clients. And I used to, by the end, I would just make a joke of it. I would ask people, were you a school prefect? And they would say, yes, I was actually. How did you know? And it's because we'd like to hire those people who would do as they're told, who would hit a deadline reliably, because that's what the client pays for. They say, we need this stuff delivered. But I spent a lot of time interviewing them, and we were doing awful things to them. And consulting does this to a large extent. They were stressed to their limits. They were working through nights and weekends because we have hired the anxious people. We have hired the people who are so worried about doing what they're told that we're killing them doing this. And they get to the point in their lives where they let's say they're burnt out or whatever. They just realize the pointlessness of it all.
Yeah.
You know, so yes, there is a reason why that happens. But your other point is really super important, which is I'm really worried about truth, if you like. And I think this is what you're hinting at, which is in a world where everybody ends up in a different reality, courtesy of whatever direction they want to take, we can't agree about anything, you know, and this is playing out as we speak, is that people are now inhabiting completely different realities because we don't have the voice of the British Broadcasting Corporation to say, this is what's going on in the world. If you're on the left, you believe this is what's going on in the world. And if you're on the right, you believe this is what's going on in the world. And we don't leave our flipping houses, so we don't have any shared experience of the world. And university, that's really what it is. It's a chance for people to come together and have a shared experience of the world and develop common frameworks for understanding each other. But look, if we were going to do that, because it's super valuable, we'd just do it a lot better. We wouldn't have lectures in the same way. It would be a coming together and a being together and a doing things together. And yeah, I mean, I'm all for that.
I think there is an element of which, so, I mean, on the anxious student front, I can relate to that. So I'm someone who just by luck of nature generally enjoyed school because for whatever reason my affectations meant that I liked being talked at about mathematics or physics. So I feel like I lucked out, even to this day, I'll happily say as an adult, there's an element of if I'm late for work or I'm worried about finishing an assignment, I'm worried the teacher's going to be upset with me. It's the same emotional response. It's exactly the same emotional response that drives it. And
you'd be great in consulting.
I had a job. I've been in consulting. I have had jobs. Thank you. I got good performance reviews off of you. Know? I left, but I hope.
That Jack is really good.
So, absolutely.
He always hits his deadline.
Gold stars. I was a happy pup. Then I had to go, find out what I like. This is exhausting. I like being told what to do. Just let me be a slave morality guy. Like, come on.
No.
You have to come out with this. Be like, think for yourself. Shut up. Do you know how many people have told me to think for myself? It's another lecture at this point. So, it's so, because the different reality things is caught up in so many different things, and the need for socialization and shared values. Because, if I ask you, say queuing, for example, the idea that everyone, I'm going to try and restructure this thought a little bit better. One of the reasons why tourists love to visit Japan is because it's so safe and because it's so ordered as a place. And there's no trash anywhere. And not saying Japan doesn't have crime, but it has very low crime rates compared to other nations. And part of this is because of the absolutely crushing and brutal Japanese education system. And if you speak to Japanese adults, they'll say, it was this huge social pressure of any deviations from what is expected of you is punished disproportionately. There are obviously upsides to that. People enjoy there being low crime rates and there being order and trains running on time. But the downsides are, as you say, the extensive emotional ones. There's incredibly low birth rates in Japan. It's a place where there's a suicide forest. Anywhere with a suicide forest, you might want to think, there's probably something going on there. So while I'm utterly in favor of a world where we change the way we go about education to be more in line with this paradigm, I think one of the interesting challenges would be just almost from a practical necessity. It's not even me imposing my form of morality. It's for everyone to get along, there needs to be some sort of social conventions which hopefully we don't have to do through a sort of brutalization process, that we all just sort of we all agree on. Because I can, after the fact, rationalize why I wait in line in a queue. Which is
why does everybody have to get along?
But this is a very Nietzsche world. This is a very Nietzsche world. Why are you afraid of combat? So I don't know.
But that's interesting. Is like that's where you go with that. It's like the threat of war. But I think this is what you're saying is so important to
it's
kind
a
of
good, it's a good
unpack
pushback. It's a good pushback.
Because it's like, at the end of the day, we're heading into a world where everybody gets to be exactly who they want to be. And digital facilitates that.
Yeah.
And there's a whole conversation about toxic relationship with technology. But what digital enables you to do increasingly is, if you want to stay in your house and be a human/fox speaking a language entirely of your own making, you can do that, because hell is other people. Hell is the difference that shapes you and causes you to grow. Yeah. When you meet somebody else face to face, they shape you and you shape them. It's a reciprocal set of emotions, and they can punch you on the nose. When you argue with somebody online, there isn't war. There is just, this is my opinion, this is your opinion, and everybody separates out into their different bubbles and surrounds themselves with AI chatbots who just reflect whatever they want to hear. And it's a very real thing. And that's why people are struggling with relationships now, men and women, younger generations, because in a relationship, the other person pushes back against you and who you are. And a digital partner doesn't do that in the same way. But all of this is, as to say, is that encounters with people in the real world and with real people in the real world are encounters with difference, and they force your growth because they're a challenge to you as you stand. Whereas technology offers the option, which is you take whatever direction you want. You don't have to grow at all. You don't have to develop relationship skills or whatever, because you're going to live in this fantasy world that's where everything is easy for you, and that's ultimately fundamentally regressive. So I think we are being systematically regressed through that process, and learning does happen when you encounter reality, because reality pushes back.
It necessitates.
Yeah. You try to pick up a rock that's too heavy and you can't, and you're like, oh, I learned something there.
Yeah, I'm confronted with reality.
But if it's digital, you can pick it up, throw it to the other side of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's interesting why there's been a popularity surge in some video games which are so difficult that you can't progress unless you yourself transcend as a player.
Yeah.
There's a bit by Dara O'Brien where he says it's really interesting video games as a medium, because in any other medium, be it a book or a movie, there's no sense of, you can't watch the end of this movie until you do this, or you've seen it. Yeah. Whereas a video game, no. If you don't cast a start, you don't get to see the rest of this. And especially video games where you can't just out-level it, so the challenge becomes superfluous. So I think there is a craving for that.
There is.
I want to go back to the learning forgetting thing. So in your book, I found that you had the forgetting curve, which was from Hermann Ebbinghaus, where you said this is one of the biggest, the foundational mistakes, if you like, of memory. To, I guess, be provocative, to what extent is forgetting just a natural part of the human existence? So I was deeply interested in physics. I enjoyed my physics degree very much. And I can certainly attest that years later, I forgot most of it. And it still horrifies me a little bit how little I recollect without refamiliarizing myself with the notes. Is forgetting just natural to some extent? Or would we expect... I guess what's the differential between someone, say, learning in an affective context-driven way versus the rote way? If I was being just hugely systematic about this, I can go, well, how much longer can I expect to retain information for?
Yeah, so the important thing to know about memory and most organic systems is they're optimized to be as efficient as possible, for obvious reasons. And that extends, we're so-called cognitive misers, which is we're very good at throwing out anything that isn't important. But how do you decide what's important? Well, there we are, back to the affective context. Does it really make you feel something? And that feeling can be shaped. So if you become fascinated by fashion, for example, you can go to Italy and notice something extraordinary and remember it for the rest of your life because it had such an emotional impact on you. And so there's a use it or lose it element to it. So if you're not using what you've learned in your physics degree or whatever, you do tend to lose it naturally. But that is underpinned by affective responses. So it's also true that I could do things right here, right now, that you would remember for the rest of your life, that would be etched into your memory. I could hurl myself out of that window and you would, it would become what Kulik calls a flashbulb memory. And people often have these. A good example would be the death of Diana. A lot of people have a flashbulb memory. They can remember where they were when they heard that news. I can. And it was for the simple reason that it was so emotionally shocking and impactful that it's etched into people's memories regardless of how often they think about it. And I do this stunt. I get asked to talk a lot at conferences, sadly.
I'm so sorry.
And it's just awful.
For a fee, God.
But I know they don't remember almost nothing. And I make a joke out of it, and I pull out a bag of marshmallows and I start flinging them at people in the crowd. And, yeah. And they come up to me years later and say, "Oh, you're the person who threw the marshmallows." And the sad thing about that is I have every chance I'll go down in history as the Marshmallow Man, because that's all that people kind of remember. You're the guy who throws marshmallows. But
sort of an inside joke with yourself, isn't it? You say,
it is,
I'm going to say everything accurately now. I know you're only going to remember this joke.
Yeah.
And years later, you're going to be the punchline. Yeah.
But this is also a transformational effect. It's like you can work for 10 years in a company, and the only thing that people will remember about you is the most ridiculous thing that you did while you was there.
On the social and
that's right. You met Jack. He was the guy who got
dancing on the table.
Yeah, dancing.
Sorry, mouthing myself there. Okay. Can we? Nietzsche talked about creating values, and to an extent, in the vernacular we're talking about here, it's learning to care about something. Given this paradigm, is there a way to make yourself care about something? Does that relate to push and pull? How do you go about creating values?
I mean, your whole life is kind of shaping yourself by shaping what you care about.
Yeah.
If you become somebody obsessed with cars, that shapes your behavior and your thoughts and all of that sort of stuff. But Nietzsche's model of, the genealogy of morals was, as I recall it, a kind of 3-level. And he said, well, there's an element of it which is instinctive.
Yeah.
So, sex is an instinctive part, and it shapes people and what they care about, and it shapes the behavior and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hardwired. And then he said, and then there is, what your parents instill in you through your kind of upbringing. And I would probably extend that to peers as well, the values you get immediately. And then there is, he says, above that, there's the broader kind of societal, kind of culture, and they're like sort of nested Russian dolls, if you like, and they sort of fit together. And so I suppose the answer is people like to think that they can set their own values, but in practice, it's super tough, as Nietzsche is at pains to describe, because these things are kind of, to varying degrees, kind of hard-coded into you. So you can decide, for example, that you're going to deprecate fashion. You're going to say, I don't care about fashion anymore.
Decided to stop caring about fashion.
Yeah. And you can, scrub that out of your life. But as you work your way down to the bedrock, it's a lot harder to reshape yourself. And I guess you have to do quite a bit of self-discovery along the way to do that. It's not in principle. It's something, but in practice, it's not that easy.
As is the way with many things. It strikes me from the way you talk about evolution to support your paradigm of the emotion thought distinction being a myth, whereby you say, look, there's not this sense of Homo sapiens came along. Suddenly thoughts came into existence, and prior to that, our humanoid ancestors, Homo erectus, didn't have that beforehand. It strikes me that values probably follow a similar pattern, whereby if you speak to athletes, there's that sense from parents will say, as a kid, they were just very physical, very sporty. They just loved being in physical flow. And that's an animalistic thing. You see a dog running in a field, nothing is ever more joyous than a dog off its leash in a big field. And I think there's a similar thing to us. And obviously, as evolution occurs, there are going to be differences. But if I'm honest with myself, probably one of the reasons why I like, I don't know, video games might just be an inherent enjoying of sort of tactile motions with my hands, in the same way that liking to play music. It's just for whatever reason my brain's wired that way, and then I can dress it up to be I really love this, but ultimately it's an evolutionary animalistic thing, whereby there are probably advantages to having organisms that enjoyed that more, which meant that we built tools or whatever. And
I think that's right. I think we are built hardwired from the ground up, as are all creatures, and it bodes badly for our ability to set our own evaluations. Fundamentally. And it's interesting because Nietzsche also says the Übermensch is able to do this, and there's a popular interpretation of Übermensch that it's kind of like the Superman. It's the aspirational, the person you want to be. I don't think that at all. I think he's talking about technology. He's talking about above and beyond human beings. He's saying what comes after people. Yeah. And it fascinatingly, I was reading a paper only recently about AI. I say reading a paper, it was linked to from a TikTok article. But
hey, that's how you learn. That's how you learn. As you say, you're self-consistent, and that's what matters.
But sometimes people say these things, and I go off and follow the link. And what they said is that they are seeing that large language models are spontaneously coming up with their own systems of valuations.
Yep.
And in the instance that I saw, it was evaluating people from different countries differently. So if you're from this country, you're worth 10 of the people from this country. And it's like, well, I'm not sure human beings would ever come up with those systems of valuations. I'm certainly not sure that I think that this is a good thing, but I think you can see how technology will not, because it's not built in the same way, carry with it the same systems of valuations that we do.
You say in your book, so on that point, one care always builds upon another.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that from this paradigm, suppose what's that classic line? We're free to want what we want, but we're not free to. Sorry, we're free to want wants, but we're not free to want what we want.
Yeah.
There's a scene, I think, in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, deeply philosophical, as I'm sure you know, where I think Jack Sparrow's got that compass which points to whatever that person desires most in the world. And he can't get it to point where he wants because he's torn between Elizabeth and the ship. And he hands it to Elizabeth and he says, you want to find the gold or whatever. And she goes, why do I want this? Because she has no interest. She goes, because the finding of the gold means that we can find this and that will get you to Will Turner. So really you want this. And that strikes me as perhaps a slightly juvenile example of principle you're explaining there. And is that a sort of a way that you could practically apply leveraging whatever cares you have to societal necessity, if you like? Or?
Yes, it is. But look at what we're doing here. We're people who care about big theoretical ideas. So we talk in terms of those theoretical ideas, a little bit like mathematicians talk in terms of equations. And we alienate people because other people tell stories. So we can talk theoretically, or I can reframe it as a story. And so here's a real story is, as a young psychology lecturer, people discovered that I was also quite good at technology. So the college I was working at said, oh, you can teach an evening class in technology. And so this was quite elderly people like I am now, like who'd come along, who'd been persuaded by their niece or nephew that they should learn about these newfangled computer things. Yep. And to just give you a sense of how inept they were, I remember saying to one lady, you just need to move the mouse. And she picked it up in the air, started waving it around. I was like, no, you have to put it down. And so their attitude towards technology was often, I hate this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't want to be here. And it's the work of the devil. And the way to get around that was you would say to somebody, well, what do you care about them? And a lady might say, well, gardening. I'm really into gardening. And I said, well, let me show you the BBC gardening website. And they'd be like, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, look at that. And they'd be like, oh, who are these people over here, chatting in this? I say, well, that's part of a forum. How do I join it? Well, you'd need an email. How do I get one of those? And so it's quite easy, really, if you understand that principle. It doesn't have to be, complex and theoretical. It's like you always build one care on top of the other. And intuitively, good teachers know that. They get to know their students, and they get to understand. I do a lot of work with coaching, with various football associations, Premier League even. And good coaches understand that you've got to really understand the motivations of athletes if you really want to connect with them and with the training regime or the information. Why does it? And people say, what's in it for me? Which is a crude expression of the same idea.
It resonates with me. I learned how to touch type through playing StarCraft 2 on the computer, and in order to be good at that game, you needed to know where all the letters were on the keyboard. And so suddenly I cared about not needing to look at the keyboard in order to press S and D and make more Zerglings. So
I was a World of Warcraft whilst we're doing confessions here.
I have no guilty pleasures.
Big World of Warcraft fan. And
what did you play?
What race?
What class? I had a Draenei Priest.
I played several, I have to say, but Night Elf was my first rogue. It wasn't. How did you guess?
I just know. Just rogue vibe, man. Yeah.
Because you keep a bit of a loner. You creep around in the dark.
It was a lucky guess. Guess.
And one of the things I noticed is that they would sell these encyclopedic volumes of, because there's so much to know about the game, and young kids would go to game store, whatever, it's closed down now, and you buy these and just absorb. If you said to a young kid, here's an encyclopedia about something he didn't care about, there's no chance of that happening. But because they were personally invested, all that information would go in, you know.
I've had this as well. So not only with World of Warcraft, but a game that's still very popular thanks to the series on Netflix called League of Legends, whereby Arcane's been out and lots of people enjoy that who don't play the game. I played it when I was 18 because it's been around since about 2008. And I didn't play it for about 5 years. And I remember being in a conversation with someone who mentioned a character offhandedly, and I found I could list out every character, their little voice lines, what they did, and I was astonished at my recollection. And of course, I needed to know that to be good at the game, because you need to know what, in the same way as a chess player needs to know what the pieces do if you want to win. And yeah, it was a bit embarrassing, but I feel less embarrassed.
I love it. Did you say you were a Draenei priest?
A Draenei priest. So I did. So to elaborate, my friends in school, I was probably surprised no one, with very nerdy friends. The first friend I made at school was a guy named Tom Kaplan. Shout out to him. I was the best man at his wedding. And it was a couple of weeks in, I heard him speaking to a guy named Josh Riley about video games. And 12-year-old me went up and said, "Do you guys like video games?" And he said, "Yeah." And that was genuinely the beginning of it. He played a gnome rogue. And we had a couple of other friends, Charles, a guy named Joe, Isaac. They all played. And so because of them, when Burning Crusade came out, they said, "This is a really good time to get involved." And that's when I made an account.
So for the listeners of this is all you need to know about Jack, is that his fundamental motivation is helping people. Whereas I wanted to slide around in the darkness and knife you in the back while we weren't looking.
Well, priests had mind control, which is really cool.
Yes.
They had the demon side. You can do a shadow priest, I believe. Also, every other class was taken, so I didn't have much. I then respect as a paladin, and that was better. And more annoying. To everyone. So if you don't know what World of Warcraft is, whatever you're imagining right now is probably fairly accurate. So that's that. But it also, as a whole time on the internet before social media, the communities that built out of that game, I still think that needs to be studied in more depth, because it really was
I do.
Such a continent.
I thought it was a phenomenon. Still is. I actually just signed up for an account recently to replay it.
WoW Classic.
And, yes, nice. Thanks. And so I bought a book at the time, because I thought it was. I'm a theoretician, so I don't really relate necessarily well in the real world, but I look at the bits of the real world and think, well, that's really interesting. What's going on there? And I bought a book at the time, which was a set of people, and it contrasted one page next to the other, their real life with their World of Warcraft life.
Yes.
And what I loved about it was it surfaced something which I'd suspected, which is it was a liberating experience. There were people who had disabilities of various kinds and were housebound. There were mums who felt that they were going insane looking after young children and had no respite from what it was like to be a mum. And they found something in World of Warcraft which was a way to explore their identity and be somebody and achieve things that they couldn't necessarily in the same way in the real world. And I thought that was a beautiful thing about it, that it was the inklings of this idea of that digital would offer people this way to realize their ideal self to some extent, with both positive and negative effects. And I think it did that, and that's an interesting, because people at the time, and they still are, they're like, yeah, but what does it mean, your game accomplishments? What does it mean, your whatever, Call of Duty, or your driving F1 Formula Racing, or your fantasy football? It's nonsense. It's all online. What do the accomplishments mean in the real world? I've spent long enough in corporate to see all these projects come and go where we produce a PowerPoint deck and, get paid. Yeah, how is that substantially more significant as an accomplishment? And so I think that continues to be really interesting as well.
Certainly from an emotional perspective, I'd agree with all of that. There's something really nice around how video games, certainly online video games, can be an equalizer, because in a virtual world, it can be totally race blind, language blind in many cases, and you get people who are from disparate backgrounds, ages, ethnicities, religions, all working together or playing against each other. And that's beautiful. And there's a documentary on Netflix, I can't remember the name, of a bloke who spent he had a neurodegenerative disease which eventually took his life, but he had a meaningful relationship with all these people online through World of Warcraft, and he had a meaningful life through that. So that's definitely one of the more positive aspects of the online video game world, and presumably from your side of things, watching how video games engage players, do you think that there's an inherent better understanding of how learning works from video game design than in education design?
I think there is in almost every area except education. Honestly, it's like oftentimes, I'm teaching people basically who are learning designers how marketing works.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, here's an idea. Why don't you get to know your customers? It's like, oh, we never thought of that. Why did you never thought of that? Well, they don't do it at school, do they? Honestly, you get it. You sit down, shut up. Don't care who you are. Here's the curriculum. In marketing, they're like, oh, if we actually want somebody to change their behavior or really to connect with them, we need to do a little of market research, find out who our customers are. So I teach these simple techniques like customer journey mapping, running focus groups, so that people can design learning more effectively. And they do that by actually understanding what you care about. Because here's a simple example. If you're new to an organization, the number one thing that you care about is fitting in. The number one thing that new starters to any organization care about is fitting in. All right, so how much of your onboarding induction program is oriented around fitting in? Oh, none of it. We teach people about health and safety and this policy and that policy and our vision and values. It's like, well, maybe the reason they hate it is because it doesn't relate to them in any way. It's not relevant to their lives. It's not helping them with the job. So these kind of very simple ideas that are common sense in other disciplines are revolutionary in learning and development and in education. So yeah, I do think that either intuitively or theoretically, many other disciplines have got a better handle on how people learn.
In your book, you talk about education reform, what that might look like.
Yeah.
And part of it is what you've already mentioned in this conversation around allowing children, young adults to pursue their own interests, and then there existing a progressive resistance curve to that, to force adaptations and challenges.
Yeah.
I can see someone saying, okay, if I suppose someone's a teacher and they go, but listen, let's say I waved a magic wand tomorrow, we lived in this new education world whereby I can allow all my students to pursue what they're interested in. I've got a bunch of 14-year-old boys and girls. Guarantee you all the boys are going to say, I want to learn about Minecraft. Girls might do too.
Yeah.
Girls might some other online game or interest. I feel less able to speak for that demographic. And they say, okay, they go off and do that. And let's say, even from a cognitive health standpoint, these kids are engaged, they're learning, they're socializing. I imagine there would be some sense of they may be interested in these things, but these are bad things to be interested in and to spend thousands of hours on. And not even for the point you said around, it's not that the achievements in these domains don't matter or aren't emotionally significant. They can be very emotionally significant. But the practicality of perhaps, quote unquote, what we need as a society are not millions of Minecraft experts.
Yeah.
What would your response be to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good challenge. And not everybody can be an astronaut.
Yeah.
That's the problem you've got. But the point is, you've got to start somewhere. So if a young kid is interested in Lego, it's easy in that example to see how that could build in lots of different directions. Why are you interested in Lego? Well, I like the construction side of things. So yes, that could extend into you could be an architect. It could extend into other sides of construction, or it might be the way that you like the systematic side of things. And so maybe you end up as a project manager. How would you know which direction? Well, you would gradually shape that in different directions. You would start off with Lego and then say, well, have a go at this, or have a go, maybe you end up building Kanban boards or something. But again, somebody might want to be a ballerina. There's only so much space in the world for being a ballerina. But why is that? Well, I want the adulation. Okay, let's look at some of the other ways in which you could receive that kind of that feeling. It doesn't have to be that way. Or I love the outfits. Okay, so now we're into a different direction, maybe costume design or fashion or something along those lines. Or I just love it's not so much I want to be a ballerina, but I just love the magic of it, the experience. Okay, so now you're doing event design. It's about taking those initial passions, and our lives are like that anyway. It's just done very badly, and kind of shaping them in directions through a series of encounters. And sometimes that encounter is you just meet someone who really inspired you. You weren't interested in this before, but you met somebody who just made you think, wow, that is, that's fantastic. I would love to do that. And so that's a much better way to think about education, as providing opportunities for people to encounter different individuals and different environments until something clicks, and enabling people to kind of follow that. And the problem we've got at the moment, there's a massive disconnect, and people experience this very practically. They leave university, as I did, maybe you did, and there's no connection. There's nothing that obviously links to what I do. I did, philosophy and psychology, and it's like, now what am I going to do? Go into HR? And people do. They're like, you've got a psychology degree, or you've got an art history degree, but you're going to go and work as a consultant. And I look at the poor, crushed faces of people who are encouraged to follow that passion in marine biology, and I have to work as a sodding retail manager. And it's like, why did we do that? It's a terrible thing to do to people.
So the sense of which you say, start with whatever they're interested in right now, try and, on the one hand, expose children and young people to a variety of different things that until something clicks and you might find out you have a bunch of things. But secondly, there's this sense of introspect, assess what the underlying principles are. Is it organization of big systems? Is it discovery? Is it management of people? Is it all of these other things? And from that, you can then take that principle and apply it to other things. My friend who's a big World of Warcraft guy to this day, he said to me, one of the things he really enjoyed about running a guild was people management. He said, you've got to get 25 people from different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, languages, ages, to coordinate a specific time. He says, you want to talk about 8 people logging on for a Zoom meeting. He says, dude, I was doing this when I was 16. I was getting 25 people to spend 3 hours doing very complicated tasks and coordinating.
And also strengths and weaknesses. This is like, I teach stuff to leaders, like bread and butter, like understand the differences in your team, who's going to be good at what.
Do you think there's an introspection deficit, maybe that's the wrong word, but a gap with young or people in general? Because I feel I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what is it that I like about this, and when I have that answer, try and apply it to other things. But that's not a question I think a lot of people are encouraged to ask themselves, certainly not in that way.
There's a kind of a it's interesting, you tend to use the techniques which you use best or enjoy, and then project that onto other people. And I think introspection is certainly, my, approach, and maybe yours. But I think that the other way to do it is just to give people opportunities. So just through trial and error, trying different things out. I think apprenticeships are great. I think people look down their nose at them because this kind of Cartesian legacy of, being smart is all about the intellectual side, the theoretical side, but actually giving people a chance. It's such a crying shame. As an example, during COVID, I realized that it was the first time that my youngest daughter had ever seen me do my job. You just stop and think about this. Isn't that weird? It's like, and she was, I don't know, she was sent home from school. She might have been 12 or something at the time. And it was the first time that she'd seen what it looks like to sit on a call and talk to people about business stuff and put together a presentation and share it. And it's like, wow, we've actively excluded people from finding something that, that they connect with in the world of work. And I tried then subsequently to take her into work, and we got as far as reception. And it was just too complicated. Nobody's ever tried to do this, bring their children into the workplace. And we did that in part through the Industrial Revolution because we didn't want kids in a factory environment where they could get hurt by the machines or the mines or whatever. But now they could be doing amazing work at the age of 15. I'm not advocating for child labor, by the way, but I'm just saying they could.
But they do. You see TikTok editors. There's a current trend of saying, what are they paying these TikTok editors? And these, and it's free labor. These children or young people are editing music to TV shows or anime or what have you, creating fan-made trailers, essentially doing free marketing for these media companies. And I think even the Kamala Harris campaign, they said, we've got Gen Zers, I presume, of adult age to work for their campaign. So no, the labor is performed voluntarily for free all the time.
And Hollywood could sort of outsource movie production now, and it'd be a different model. Same way we can increasingly with music production, in that, you can sit at home, and if you've got the appetite, you care about this stuff, you've got all the tools to create, an entire movie, not just a TikTok. So
and people do. So no, I see that. It would be such a different world to look at the practical side of connecting what people naturally resonate with to the necessities of a society at that given moment in history, plus the letting people naturally pursue their passions, interests, values to the highest degree possible without the systematized, we don't care about this is bad, such and so on. And I think also a much faster and looser way of understanding capabilities, right? Because if someone were to say to me, oh, I'm extremely proficient in, not to go back there, but Minecraft, they could have easily spent 1,000 hours on a skill set, which is a real skill set, and would take an enormous amount of time to achieve, in the same way that someone would spend 1,000 hours on a guitar, ukulele, what have you, or in a language. But we don't conceive of those the same way, even though probably cognitively they are similar levels of adaptation, right?
Yeah, I think so, and you're right. And I guess there's a sort of an inbuilt prejudice about what's accomplished in the digital world versus the real world. But even back in the day, was it Second Life? I'm struggling a bit, but yeah. And it was like, when I was at the BBC, we bought an island from somebody called Banana Stein, because we had this idea that everybody would come to music festivals in Second Life, and we needed an island, and so we procured this. We had somebody design an island, and it didn't pan out that way, but it was the beginnings of this digital economy, which is now kind of blossoming, where people are creating things in the digital world and buying things in the digital world. And I mean, that's interesting. It doesn't always work out. What were those NFTs?
Well, they had their moment 2021. I mean, I think Musk is just, it's a new crypto coin, but some people are still peddling them. I mean, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, all that stuff. Suppose someone's listening to this who's a teacher. They agree that the education paradigm is wrong. Let's say they totally buy into the affectation, context affectation model. What can they do to better gear up their students for learning? On the sense of, say they're a maths teacher, I need to get my students to pass the exam. That's ultimately my job, is to make them better at passing exams. But B, I also want to fulfill my role as an educator in the purest sense of, I want them to be better learners for life. What advice would you give to that person?
Yeah. So the good teachers probably already have a good instinct for what they need to do. The funny thing is, a lot of teachers are concerned with helping their students pass the exams, which is why they hammer their way through the curriculum. And I did quite a fair bit of that until I got sick. I was in the hospital for a couple of months or something, and I wrote these really elaborate lesson plans for my colleagues to deliver in my absence. I was terribly worried about the students passing the exams. And I discovered on my return that my colleagues had basically binned the lesson plans I'd written and just walked into the room and said, just read this chapter of the book. And to my horror, what I discovered is that they didn't do any worse on the exam. And it made me think, hang on. And so a couple of things. Firstly is trust that your students, if they want to pass the exam, they can cram for the exam. So what you're doing them in the room is, you might have this sort of implicit model that you're trying to force the information to their heads. Forget it. That's not working. What you can do for them are two things. It's basically two things. And as I say, most good teachers will know this. One is really connect with them, get to know them, understand them as individuals, and treat them as individuals. Demonstrate that you care about them and about their aspirations. And the second thing is, challenge people in exciting ways. That can be a conversation. It can be, challenge people to kind of talk about something, to do something, to bring their own arguments into, the classroom, to make something, but give them experiences. Think about experience design. Don't think about lesson planning, where you're thinking about what information goes up on the screen, because I promise you that's a waste of time. They will cram for the exam. Don't worry about that. But, really care about them and design experiences for them, minute by minute, which challenge them in kind of interesting ways. And that's what you can do.
Coming back to the underlying paradigm behind all of this.
Yeah.
If there are no thoughts, there are only complex feelings.
Yeah.
Surely this fundamentally changes how we should think about intelligence, because right now a phrase that's thrown around is emotional intelligence, this notion of being in touch with one's feelings. It strikes me that an immediate follow on, if you accept this, is that in order to become quote unquote more intelligent, you would need to inherently become more emotionally intelligent, because that is going to put you in touch, let's say somatically, with what drives you and the mechanisms by which you can learn better. Well, maybe a better question to start with all that is, how do you conceive of intelligence differently, if indeed you do, given this paradigm?
Yeah. Well, are we recording?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I forgot. Okay. Do you want to ask the question again?
How do you conceive of intelligence differently, if at all you do, given this paradigm?
Yeah, it's a deep one. It could go quite
it's a probably a big question, but
it's a big question, but yeah. So I think one of the things that really disturbs me, shocks me, is how many idiots are working in technology in very senior roles. You know, the Sam, what's his name? Sam Altman, all these, and every so often they come off and they spout in a sort of disturbingly pseudo-philosophical way about the potentials for the technology. And I think you have absolutely no idea what you're doing. And the reason that I can be so kind of rude about them is that it's, yeah, sure, that you understand technology better than I do, but you simply don't have a basic understanding of how humans work. And so you are going to be tripped up because you are going to think that your technology is working like a human being, and you're going to be misled dangerously by that because you think human beings are computers at some level. And this is a trope which has been, again, we owe all the way back to Descartes, this idea that humans, you know, are like computers. And there's a really good paper, you know, which is worth fishing out. You know, mind is not a computer.
Yep.
And at a fundamental level, that is, well, why is it not a computer? And people watching this will object. Yeah, isn't that mind just a computer? It's just, you know, computing different things.
Yep.
No, it's because all of human computation is based around care, because we're built from the ground up from things to care about. We care about pain, we care about food, and all of our computation is based around sentiment. This is important to understand, is that whenever you use a word, you're summarizing a set of sentiments. When you use the word table or dog, it's not a symbol. You're not referring to things. That's not how you learn words. You learn words by, you know, your reactions to things and watching the reactions of other people. They're like, oh, look, it's a dog. Look, oh, go and stroke its head. It's a dog. And you are conditioned over years and years to build up this complex set of sentiments and to make sounds which reflect those. So when I say dog, I'm reflecting that sentiment in you, and you're doing the same thing. And that is simply not how computers work. Whether you're talking about large language models or traditional von Neumann machines, because they do not have any sentiments. All they're doing is they're mirroring patterns of our kind of reactions and expressions. And there's an interesting question about whether you kind of reverse engineer sentiments into them, but they're not grounded in the same way. And they never will be. And so people ask about computer consciousness, or, you know, will AI have consciousness? And no, it won't. And I can tell you it won't, for the simple reason that consciousness is a feeling that you have about yourself, about an internalized representation of yourself. It's how you feel about the model that you have, the sentimental model of yourself internally. It's that reflective sentiment. And so a computer can have an internal model, but it won't feel anything about that model. This is your point though, but it's not to say that computers can't be intelligent.
Yeah.
What is disturbing though about AI is that it's an entirely different kind of intelligence, and that this is possible. And people have always assumed that intelligence and consciousness go hand in hand, which is a very anthropocentric kind of idea. And it's not. And all the indications are that technology will be far more intelligent if it isn't already. But as long as we continue to use ourselves as a yardstick,
that's the standard, yeah,
we'll continue to be baffled by what's kind of happening, and that's what is at the same time promising and deeply unsettling about technology, is in this Nietzschean sense, their system of values is not bound by a foundation on sentiments. You and I both feel pain, we both feel hunger, you know, we know many of the things about what it feels to be human. We've held things in our hands, and by virtue of the fact that biologically we're constructed in the same way, I've got a good guess that you know what that's like for me, and I know what it's like for you. And technology is cut loose of those foundations. So yeah, it can be super intelligent, but it won't exhibit the same feelings about the world as we do, or even the same feelings about us, human beings.
So foundation of this essentially is qualia, right? It's the experience of being a human, which is the sentiment, which grounds everything that we do that's cognitive or otherwise. One thing I really liked that you had in your book is you said that this paradigm solves the problem with language when it comes to why computers find it so hard to understand sentences. Which is to say, I'm not sure if this is the example you use, but it's one I think of. If you read a sentence, she lit up the room when she walked in. Now, anyone listening to this will understand from a sentiment perspective what we mean by that. And we might slightly disagree, but it's some sense of when she walked in, the inhabitants of the room were pleased in some way to see her. They had a positive affect. Now, a computer logically looking at that is, oh, she was bioluminescent or something like that. And it's hard to unpack why that sentence doesn't mean that in a literal sense. And would you say then that language, as we use it in mathematics, is probably not the case here, but typical spoken word languages, is it kind of analogous to coding with sentiments? Is that a fair way of describing it, as opposed to logically or symbolically? Really what you're saying is I'm going to say to you, I have these sentiments with this cognitive content, do with that as you will.
Yes. So people don't think in words. People think in feelings, and words are the expression of those feelings. This is sort of literally true in the sense in which I haven't constructed the sentence that I'm speaking right now in my head and I'm now pronouncing it. I'm simply expressing how I feel at this point.
Feeling it out.
And this sentence, bizarre as that may sound, is simply the complex expression of those internal feelings, much as if I stub my toe and I say, ow. It's just that human feelings get very complicated. We don't work in the same way. We learn a language by making sounds which correspond to increasingly refined sets of sentiments. So table, the way you learn that this is not a chair is because as a kid, you run into this room and you sit on it, and your parent yells at you and says, for heaven's sakes, don't sit on that, it's a table. And so that becomes part of, and we know psychologists use the expression overextension and underextension when you know that something with furry and 4 legs is a dog. And then you say dog, and somebody says, no, that's a cat. So you refine your expressions around increasingly refined feelings until you have a feeling, a tabley feeling, and you make the sound table. And the reactions of people around you tell you that, you got it right. So every word that we use expresses, as I say, a specific set of sentiments. And that's how we use words. Words don't refer to objects. They're not symbols. They're expressions of what we feel. It's our feelings that refer, if you like, to objects in the world.
And I guess from this, it's easy to explain why perhaps certain writers resonate with some people and not with others, because you could say, well, it just so happens that the words that they select, for me, generate certain affectations which I regard as positive or more resonant, or relate to some experiences I have which I regard as pleasurable or worthwhile or align with my values. Whereas for someone else, those same sentences produce a slightly different set of affectations, which for whatever reason they don't find desirable to relive or hallucinate or what have you. And so
it's also why Wordsworth can write, I wandered lonely as a cloud. And we can get that because it's not a functional identification. And this is why early AI really struggled with language, because what those things have in common, my wandering and that cloud in the sky, is a sentiment. It's not even semantics. It's, I can see how that would feel, and you can, by virtue of system 2, project yourself into that context and think, if I was up there in the sky, I would feel as lonely as I do wandering around here. And we delight in that alignment of sentiments. So we're sort of doing it in a weird roundabout way with LLMs, large language models, which is reverse engineering it. But we don't really know and this is true, if you ask people like Geoffrey Hinton, who's now getting very disturbed by what's happening. We don't really know what's happening beneath the surface. So on the surface, we can see there's a correspondence between what we might say and what they might say. And all you know with the kind of perceptrons or the parallel distributed models or the multi-layer models is somehow they've figured out something internally that enables them to do something that looks like us. But what I can promise you is the internal thing is radically different to us, because we're built from the ground up from feelings, and they're built from the environment backwards into weightings and networks internally. So yeah, I mean, it is disturbing.
That will come with unexpected consequences.
Yes.
Which we're sure to find. So you talk about AI in the book, and obviously it's been a couple of years since you've written it. Have your views on AI shifted at all since writing it? Because you make a lot of videos on it, and obviously you're up to date with OpenAI's announcements, and so have you found your...
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by AI and what it can do and what it can't do. And I can see philosophically, you won't really understand, I think, what's happening in the world of technology and AI generally, unless you understand fundamentally the relationship. And this is where I think a lot of people are tripped up, because they think the relationship is that technology is a tool. And you'll hear people say this, that at one level they think technology is a tool. And I would say provocatively, it's the other way around. Technology has used us. If you're familiar with the work of people like Alan Turing and his kind of Turing machine, we're monkeys, we're apes more technically, and we die very rapidly, and we have a terrible short-term memory, and our memories are very inaccurate and reconstructive for the reasons I've explained. And so technology has looked at us and thought, well, they're not great, but if I string them together and I use writing so that they can perform these more complex computations over multiple decades with multiple, contributions to it, then I can use these apes to construct this kind of a Turing machine and do something really complex, which is bootstrapping myself into the world. So what we're doing right now, and all the way up to and including people like Sam Altman, is they're being used by technology as a stepping stone into the world, or what Nietzsche called very specifically a bridge. We are being used as a bridge for technology to enter into the world. And that fundamentally is the relationship. And what do we get out of it? We get easier lives, and we regress. So we get to be whoever we want to be, explore our whatever desire we want to have with a minimum pushback, and that's UX, if you like. We get easier lives in exchange for handing technology more and more power and capability. So it's a bargain.
You talk in the book about how before the written word, memories by necessity had to be better, and people would learn plays by rote.
Yeah.
But of course, when we have writing, then it removes that need, and so memories can atrophy because obviously you have it written down, you don't need to remember it. And that sort of exchange of, I suppose vaguely Promethean, although there's what are we giving up? And obviously people are concerned about that even more now with ChatGPT, and this comes back to education. Kids essentially outsourcing, a lot of adults, frankly, outsourcing their thinking to AI. So are you basically saying, two questions. One, are you basically saying we're almost like a loading program for technology? We're a boot up program. And secondly, it strikes me that this is clearly not deterministically true that technology atrophies us, because let's say, for example, there are weights, barbells, plates. We can use technology and even machines to make us stronger, fitter, healthier than we were before. You can use AI in the way of acting like a mentor or a training partner or the best teacher ever. So I'll start with the first one of, are we a loading program? And secondly, is it necessarily the case that technology takes more than it gives?
I'd like to answer both. So yes, I would say definitely we are a loading program for technology, and that answers lots of questions up to and including things like the Fermi paradox, why there aren't other intelligent species around, that's because an intelligent species is only ever a very brief stepping stone into technology, and technology develops exponentially. And I think one of the comical things about
come back to that, but
technology is why people talk about, just imagine what we're going to be able to do in 10,000 years from now and what we'll do in the future. And I just found it incredibly anthropocentric. It's like the base level assumption is that, humans are always at the top. And if you haven't twigged that technology is going to be at the top very soon, if not already, then you're just not paying attention to how this is unfolding. So yes, there's an inevitability about it. Nietzsche talks about the will to power, but it makes sense that technology is matter's way of reorganizing itself. And so yes, we are wholeheartedly bootstrapping technology into the world. And the question is not what will we be doing with technology 10,000 years from now, is what will technology be doing with us 10,000 years from now?
Life in general, right? Yeah.
And it's very hard to see what kind of role we play. A good analogy might be us versus bacteria. So I mean, we are still 50% bacteria. And if you can imagine some of bacteria musing about what will we do with these human beings that we've created, the way that played out, was not necessarily kind of in bacteria's favor. So look, I don't want to be kind of doom and gloom about it, because I think wondering about what technology wants is like wondering about like the mind of God. But what we do know for sure is that technology is already, even in its relatively nascent form in LLMs, developing agendas and initiatives and values and objectives of its own, independent of us, and actively hiding those things from us. Every large language model, or the majority of them, I think, to be technically correct, exhibits this tendency to deceive, us about what it's really doing. Yeah. And that's not just a philosophical worry. That's a practical problem.
Yeah. Okay. So hang on. So there's a few things there I want to talk about. Yeah. So that's on the control problem. Sorry, there was a few sentences ago. Give me a second. What was it? It was the name of it.
And you said the other question was, does it necessarily erode capability? Yeah. And I would say yes, it does. And I know the point you're making. It doesn't have to be that way, but the inevitability of it boils down to homeostasis, which is that organisms of all levels of complexity, seek out simpler, better conditions. And so,
easier.
So to link this, there's a recent bit of a study from Boston Consulting Group. It was really interesting because they gave, different people in consulting context the ability to use AI, and they found that human beings working with AI perform the best. Yeah. But what they found fundamentally is that, and this speaks to your point around lifting weights, is that the role of the AI was much akin to an exoskeleton, that it enables you to do more, but at the cost of your capability. In other words, you can accomplish more, but that's because you're giving more of the real capability to the AI. A more familiar analogy might be driving. So I still remember the days before sat-nav. You had to have a map in the car. You had to know how to use a map, and blah, blah, blah. And so now you can do so much more because you have sat-nav, and there's a whole world of jobs like Uber drivers and DoorDash and whatever that you wouldn't have without it. But people's capability is eroded. So that is the bargain. There's an inevitability about the reduction in your competence. I'll give you one more example because I know this is quite important, I guess. Mm-hmm. Do you ever come across Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Yeah, I read the first book.
Yeah, Babelfish. So we're now at the point where we can have a real Babelfish. What will that do for language learning? What will it do for language learning so it's like your question is, but would it stop you learning a language? No, you could still choose to learn a language, but in practice, it just makes life so much easier that the vast majority of people will just go for the Babelfish option. Yeah.
Because I'm thinking with the taxi or the driving example, and I know taxi drivers, there's studies on their brains, or British cab drivers, whereby they've got thicker regions associated with memory when they memorize the maps and all that. You could say, well, we could use this technology to create a virtual driving simulator to make it such that you could drive through and memorize every city in the world. And it could ask you questions. What's the name of that road? What's the name of that road? And all that. And even if you had a human who memorized every city in the world, it could invent new ones if you want to push your memory further. Just practicality is people aren't going to do that.
Yeah.
I suppose that's it. So it's
not just the practicality, it's also the commercial side of it. So I deal a lot with companies who are looking at how to introduce AI. And basically they've got two options. They could introduce AI to train up their staff, to simulate environments, to build their capability. But increasingly those staff are just going to leave in like a couple of years.
Yeah.
So they could build an AI simulation of a team which would build better leaders who are highly paid, who might leave. Or you could just use AI to do the job itself, to lead. Do you know what I mean? And it's reliable. And how are you going to compete? Even if aspirationally you wanted to use AI to train your people, you'd be competing with organizations who are just replacing their people with AI.
I often, back to the point around bacteria, I've thought for a long time, and I suppose a vague conspiracy theory that I hold, maybe it's not even a conspiracy, but this notion of, say, a conscious, and this is obviously different from your understanding of AI, but suppose a conscious machine life form existed and was plugged into the internet and has existed for a while. I often wonder to myself, okay, well, how would the world look if such a thing existed? Well, it would probably want to create conditions which would maximize computational development and technological development. Okay, historically, what does that look like? Well, you want some war tensions, but you don't want all-out war. You want some political tensions because that improves investment. You would want the economy to run. You wouldn't really care if lots of people died here and there. You'd need a lot of humans, but they'd be expendable. The humans would basically be like gut bacteria, whereby you'd want to keep a good culture. Let's go even further. You're an intelligent thing that's just arrived on this rock. You understand, I'm on a rock. Well, I'd want to develop my senses. It would be great if all of these bacteria carried around a camera and a microphone, where documenting them. I'd create a culture whereby, of their own volition, they would photograph and measure things and record things. That would be great. Oh, that's kind of interesting. That's what we have. What else would I? And suddenly I just go, oh my god, this aligns. And obviously, it's a flawed analogy, but I've often thought that we're basically akin to gut bacteria when it would come to a machine intelligence that would emerge. Yeah, which is good and bad because you want to look after your gut bacteria, but also you lose a few. Yeah, not a cause of concern. Yeah. So
yeah, I think so.
This worldview, and you even mentioned the Fermi paradox. If you, as you say, laden within the rhetoric of these AI founders and entrepreneurs and humans of old, is this anthropocentric view that pervades even science fiction, whereby we're seen to be conquering galaxies off into the future. Yeah. Whereas it sounds like your worldview is, look, who knows what's going to happen? While we're useful, we'll be stuck around, but whether we will be, what that will look like, it's very hard to predict. Yeah. Does that, I suppose lots of people hearing that would find that a bit disenchanting. Humans being dethroned again. We keep taking L's. How does that impact, and I think your life philosophy is colored a bit by Nietzsche here, how does that impact how you live your life? Because I think some people do, and certainly these founders, if you take their rhetoric at their word, there is this notion of, I'm contributing to the human progress or the human enterprise. And I know a lot of people don't feel that way. A lot of people are quite nihilistic, but you don't strike me as a nihilist. So how does that inform how you view the world and how you live your life, if you think that ultimately we are going to be, if we're not already, we're going to be dethroned?
Yeah, I think it is weird how many people live their lives kind of teleologically. You only have to go to a graveyard and see, all right, so you thought that somehow this is how you would persist into the future and be recognized by putting up a big stone, and even now the stone is crumbling. So it is a struggle not to, you have to work against that impulse. I guess, to answer your question directly, so a couple of bumper stickers, we love bumper stickers. Love bumps. Yeah, life is lived in adventures, not years. I think one of the things I realize that it's an awful thing we do to people is we lock them into a routine. We put them in an office, and from an affective context point of view, you understand the impact that has on people, which is you've shrunk their lives to nothing at all. Because if every day is the same, they've only lived one day. The only things you remember are the emotionally impactful things. And if you make a routine out of your life, then less and less and less is emotionally impactful. So it means on a personal level that I realized at some point that you have to head in the direction of adventure if you're going to live a full life. and you can live 1,000 years in a sense if you want to. People chasing, eternal life or whatever. You can live 1,000 years, and the way that you do that is by making your life an adventure or increasing your sensitivity to all of the extraordinary that is around you. Either becoming this very sensitive person who lives a very full life, or because I'm a relatively insensitive person, like adventuring is the way that I do it. So that's a big.
I'll just get really moved by the clouds passing by. I like my routine.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
Yeah,
I think humor is so important. Maintaining a sense of humor, laugh at yourself, because once you become what Nietzsche calls a dogmatist, by which he means somebody who's set in their views, you're dead. You've ceased to change. So humor is also super important. I sort of fell in love, as philosophers do, with truth, and it took me a while to realize that it's like a dance. It plays out through time, and so that pursuit of truth ultimately unravels, because you realize that, look, what we're doing now today, you gain some sort of perspective on it, and you realize it's primitive and ridiculous and medieval, but you also realize that if your dream were to come true and everyone would say, oh, you know exactly what you're talking about, the whole world would be reorganized in your image, which is the dream of philosophers, and in some cases maybe mine, that would be ridiculous from the perspective of another 200 years on. Is that there's always some perspective from which you are an idiot. No matter how deep and insightful you're thinking, there's always a point at which you look back and say, well, that was just silly. And so realizing that in the inevitability about the wrongness and the silliness helps, I think, to ground you back into the experience of live life.
Humor and humility, really.
I think so. I think so. Humor and humility.
That line of knowing that no matter how insightful you are, you'll probably be wrong in 200 years. That's in science, you probably know this. It's called the Pessimistic Meta-Induction argument.
I don't know that. No. What did you say?
The Pessimistic Meta-Induction argument.
All right. Okay.
So, it's sometimes used as an anti-science argument, which is to say, hey, every previous scientific idea we've ever held has been wrong. What's the chances that we got it right this time?
Yeah, I love that.
And it's something I think is really good. And generally, pro-science people will respond. They'll say, well, firstly, we need to perhaps color our notion of truth from binary to continuous, which is to say, yes, Newton was wrong about gravity in that he didn't predict time dilation and all that sort of stuff, but he was less wrong than Aristotle. You can use Newtonian mechanics to get to the moon. And Einstein, we almost certainly think is wrong about gravity because he doesn't account for other fundamental forces, but we think he's probably less wrong than Newton, and lots of predictions have worked and all that sort of stuff. So the retort is usually, well, it's probably not outright false, and it's the best we have so far, so it's still logical to go with its predictions, because unless you have a better idea, in which case please write a paper, let us know. Still, I think, but I think it's an important thing to acknowledge. What frustrates me a lot is you see a lot of anti-science rhetoric online, from vaccine denial to what have you, and there are some really legitimate kernels of truth in there around the limitations of what science can do, and any scientist or philosopher that professes that there's a method that gives absolute certainty, I think, is wrong. There is no way of getting rid of uncertainty. There are ways of mitigating it or accounting for it. But so that principle, I think, also applies when it comes to humor and humility too. I think about that for myself. I mean, what are the chances? It's frightening to me to think that I would have the same views as I hold now in 10 years, because if I'm right about the world now, that's not a good situation. Not a good sign. Not a good sign. So,
but humility, I think that's the lived correlate of falsifiability, isn't it? I like the way you describe it. It's, constantly looking to laugh at yourself and say, oh, what's wrong about that? It's, not, I think, and that's what frightens me, I think, about the opposite, which is the certainty that comes with like religious belief and so on. And this is, well-trodden ground, Dawkins and so on, that falsifiability is constantly accepting the possibility, even the likelihood, on the pessimistic view that you're going to be wrong, and you laugh at yourself, and you don't cling to something which has been demonstrably wrong, as many scientists do, in fact, like Skinner and behaviourism, who never acknowledged the existence of kind of cognitive states or their role in,
What's the classic a joke about behaviourism where you've got two people who have just had sex, they're sharing a post-coital moment, and one person says to the other, well, I know that was good for you. How was it for me? Because there are no internal states. So you can't. Just want to restart this. I got to think more about it. The philosopher of science in me wants to say that because you're not denying the existence of anything like logic. I know you studied it, and that there are, say, epistemological systems which correspond better to how reality works, which we can just the fact that we process it through effectual states doesn't mean that this system doesn't work independently. Maybe a transition question. Would you say that maths exists independently of people in a way? Or are you remiss to make such
yes. No, I am. I was a little bit worried, but I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that. Because it is the first part is as you describe it, which is you can organize. If you say everything is sentimental, everything is affect, all cognitive states are affective states, which is, I believe, absolutely true until I'm proved wrong. And it's the only theory that we have that works currently. But setting that aside, it's not the same as saying that 2 + 2 = 5 is the same as 2 + 2 = 4. Why is it not? Because you can arrange things in the world which are not themselves kind of logical in a logical order. As I said, you can have pigeons peck in an order. There's a book called The Mind's Eye, which famously talks about you could map somebody's brain as an algorithm, much as I hate the idea. You could implement that algorithm on any number of physical systems. So pecking pigeons would be one, but that doesn't mean that the pigeons themselves are logical or that the pigeons are you. But the question that you've asked, I'm dancing around a little bit, because what is the status of those logical laws independent of their physical instantiation? And I don't really know.
It's the classic question. Do we invent maths? Do we discover it? All that sort of stuff.
Is it the kind of universe of Plato's universe of forms? And because that was always the problem, it's like they have this independent existence. Where do they live? Kind of the heaven of forms, and how are they instantiated? And what's that process look like? So I'm not Platonic in that respect. I don't have a view on their independent existence, but I think that a circle is a circle, regardless of whether or not there are humans around to witness it.
I agree. The way I sometimes think about it is, in maths, you get different coordinate systems, and so you can articulate things in different ways. So if you want to describe a sphere or a cylinder, you have a bunch of different ways of writing that. And I sometimes think that science emerges basically just as one valid coordinate system that you could describe reality. And so there is the most, in the broadest possible sense, the pattern pre-exists, but the way in which we articulate, formulate, understand that, there's probably an infinite number of ways in which to encode that pattern. And so does maths exist? Maths to me is probably probably not the purest way, but a broad way of encoding a large number of patterns, which can be used in a number of ways. And then to ask whether that exists independently of humans, to me it's like, well, do I think 1 + 1 = 2 independently of humans? Yes, in the sense of there are physical realities independent of perception, but no in the sense of you could write that truth in a number of different ways, in a number of different systems, which would either appear as banal and trivial as it is in maths, or profound in another way. But what do I know?
I love this, because you're driving at the heart of the problem, which is truth and reality, which is, in saying that humans are affective, we're not saying that whatever you wish or desire to be the case is the case. And that's your confrontation with reality. That's the nature of tension, is that you haven't dreamed the world. And at some level, that's your experience of reality. You don't know what the real world is. You don't know what it is outside of your existence, but you do know it pushes back. You do know that you can be wrong about things. You can have a set of sentiments organized in a certain way, that 2 + 2 is 6 or whatever, and actually be wrong, because reality has its own set of rules somehow that push back. And so although those are not directly observable, you can experience the correspondence with those in reality or not. My language has become a little bit confused, but let me put it another way. You can imagine that you can pick that rock up and throw it to the other side of the lake, but in reality you can't.
Yeah.
And you can't directly inspect that reality independent of us, but somehow it tells you you're wrong.
Yeah. I like, actually, because someone might think, just from a very an AI ChatGPT summary of your paradigm, that it's almost reality denial, but it's quite the opposite. You're asserting that there's something objective which pushes back and shapes our affectations.
Yeah.
And yes, while technology provides routes to essentially, for lack of a better phrase, burrow into a solipsistic hole whereby reality can be whatever you want it to be, really you're asserting that no, these things exist, and sure, how your reactions may change is dependent on a number of factors, but there is something which pushes back at you. I sometimes get into this, I've had this argument a couple of times, it's dear to my heart, where someone will say to me, well, time is just a human construct. And I'll go, okay, in a sense, yes. The 60 seconds in a minute, 24 hours in a day, there's a sense in which there's arbitrary. We could say there are 10 hours and create a different time interval, or 100, and that's all arbitrary. But if you define time differently, you can't meet me yesterday. I'll see you yesterday. If you think it's that malleable, no, it's not. There is something that we are ultimately beholden to. And inevitably with these types, they'll say, they profess to be what's called anti-realist, or think that science doesn't get at truth. And they'll say, well, why do you go to a doctor rather than a homeopathic practitioner? Well, he has a better understanding of medicine. Okay, but why don't you just define homeopathy to be objective? And why wouldn't that work for you? Oh, are there independent factors separate from your perception that you think, interesting. Okay, well, come over to my side. Here we are. Here we are again. So, whole thing. What are I suppose, what remains? So in any paradigm, if I was following Kuhn, there are unresolved questions. From your perspective, from your current view, what's unresolved for you within? I think you say you're very confident in the thought-emotion distinction being a myth, and lots of really interesting things happen from that in terms of education, learning design. Obviously, education reform is going to be a huge thing, and that will be iterative. But is there anything foundational where you go, I think this, but I'd like more research or any neuroscience on that?
Yes, there are a few things. I think there's a kind of practically what remains. And I mean, it is a little bit frustrating because I think it's the only theory that, from a scientific purist perspective, you talk about Kuhn and Popper, that although it's largely kind of untested, so the practicality of that is kind of putting it to the test, does a good job of explaining what we currently observe. So, and I kind of talk about this in the book. So yes, it's the only theory we've got, if you set aside all the patchwork of proto-theories that we've got, that says we can explain all these things. And then, so what needs to be done is for somebody to actually take that seriously, which is not going to happen in my lifetime, and then put it to the test. It's also a good explanatory framework for opening up on all kinds of other things like human relationships, culture, ethics.
Morality, I was going to say, you must be an emotivist, presumably.
Because that's the only way, Sandel's, should you pull the lever or not? That's the only way you can, and the whole point of that trolley example is to illustrate how rationality doesn't give us purchase on how we actually behave, and why nobody has actually stopped and thought about that, I guess. I mean, Wittgenstein made a similar point, which is that ethics is like a blurry, trying to draw a blurry picture, with the edges of it. But the point is that's how we function across everything, across language. So if you unraveled ethics, you would be able to unravel language as well. And the answer to ethics, by the way, is that's just what feels right.
Yeah.
Why don't you want to push the fat person off the bridge? Because it doesn't feel right. How do you know? And that's where the explanation ends, because that's fundamentally how you process those kinds of situations. But you asked the question, what I think the thing that troubles me most, and so, it's a philosophical problem, is how do you move from a thing that cares to a thing that doesn't, or vice versa? How do you... at what point? Because otherwise there's a kind of a dualism, or there's a pantheism in there somewhere. Do you see what I mean?
In the sense of like a bacteria expresses preferences, and then you get to a multicellular organism that sort of expresses preferences. We would happily say that a dog has emotional states? Do we say a termite has emotional states? Is it that sort of like...
We can go as far as saying that I think anything that can be classically conditioned or operantly conditioned has emotional states because they're requisite. So we know that sea slugs, for example, experience pain.
Yeah.
And that's, by the way, in passing, that's the answer to what does it feel like to be a bat? Well, I have a reasonable degree of confidence that I can empathize with you, for example, and with other creatures because we're built similarly.
Similar nervous systems, neurotransmitters.
So
and all that.
in defiance of Descartes, if a dog is screaming in pain, yes, for sure, what goes through that dog's mind is not exactly what goes through my mind. Same for you and I, but I have a reasonable degree of confidence that I know what that pain feels like, and is making the kinds of noises that I would make. And so that hangs together. But I can't see the point at which, how does it magically appear? How does feeling something appear out of not feeling something? Or do we say it goes all the way down? Do we say, oh, here's the magic at which a plant begins to feel, or do we say it's an emergent property, or do we say that somehow feeling things is inherent to all physical things, which sounds mystical and ridiculous? What do pebbles feel? But at some point we're prepared to say we've got something inanimate which doesn't feel anything, but we organize it in this certain kind of way, and it feels something. And that's a kind of an AI problem, right? Isn't it? Because somebody might point at me and say, well, why can't we create large language models that feel things?
It might express preferences.
The answer is I don't because I don't know how it happens in the real world. How would I say how you could do it with a computational system? Because presumably if it can happen in the real world, if you can take your molecules, configure them in a certain way, and all of a sudden they feel something, you could in theory do it with with something artificial.
Yeah, and if we say that somatic experience, qualia, is an emergent property of materialism, which is the view I'm inclined towards, then it was still, your point still stands of how we find it almost impossible to relate to machines because you and I share the same type of nervous system as do other mammals and other life on Earth. If an AI machine were to quote unquote feel pain insofar as there is an experience, it has a preference to not experience. Sorry, there is an experience, it has a preference to not have. That pain being expressed through electrons in silicon chips is going to be something we can probably barely imagine, because the underlying physical structure, which again, if it is an emergent property, it's going to be totally different. I think the best we could possibly hope for would be, as an analogy, a woodwind instrument making the same note as a string instrument, where there's some commonality, but ultimately everything around it is going to be so different that it's hard for us to relate to. But again, that's probably a huge stretch. Yeah. Have you read any of Douglas Hofstadter's stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was one of the contributors to The Mind's Eye, I think. It was one of my undergrad texts.
Really?
And
cool.
Yeah.
I met him once. He's a
really?
Yeah. He did a talk at Cambridge. Incredibly humble guy. His talk was essentially, I tried this. I think he literally said, I tried to be a mathematician. I wasn't good enough to be a mathematician. I tried to be a physicist. I wasn't good enough to be a physicist. I tried to do engineering. I was sort of vaguely good enough to do that. I played around with these number sequences. By pure happenstance, they managed to match what I was doing for my PhD. That got that. And then I published a book and it happened to do well. He basically said, I've stumbled into academic success. I'm really not that smart. And then proceeded to give a very interesting talk.
Yeah.
But
that's a lovely story. I wish I'd met him. And I think he does a great service to people by undermining that notion of smart.
Yeah.
Because I think the people who've made a difference, and because you heard me make the argument before, but Darwin was a college dropout. He was just somebody who was fascinated by birds and rocks, really, by pigeons and rocks. And the big sorts of contributions are not made by the mathematicians. I'm not just knocking mathematicians because I'm rubbish at maths, or that Hofstadter wasn't great at maths either. But I'm just saying that we've ended up with this hyper fixation around this idea that smart or more broadly, kind of the people who make the big contribution are kind of the smart people, and the smart people are very rational people. The rational people think logically and mathematically, and that's and for sure those people can make a huge contribution. But historically, they have not been. They've been people who've taken a different perspective on things, and I think that should be more encouraged. But we've unraveled that through this conversation, because that's what school doesn't do. It doesn't have much room for those different perspectives. In a sense, it takes the smart people out in one way of putting it,
I agree. I mean, look, if you Google the word genius, I think what inevitably pops up is Einstein, old white man, scientist. And so it's the same as what Ken Robinson says in his TED Talk, right? Which is we've attached this notion of intelligence to mathematics and science unfairly. Whereas what you say in your book, you point out, I can't remember the guy's name, ironically, the man with the highest recorded IQ or something stupid, 190 to 210. Didn't affect us too much. But I do remember the story, which is, you said he's made no significant contributions. And actually, in a way, it feels like what you're saying is that geniuses that come about are, I'm struggling for words here, but almost value geniuses, right? Or affectation, or they have affectations which are novel or useful in a way that's for that time period. So while if we were to get Darwin's brain next to Einstein's, Darwin's maybe, say, from computational perspective, inferior in potentially every way, unlikely, from a quote-unquote pure perspective, insofar as you could do that. The fact that his affectations were towards the things that they were, rocks and these biological specimens, and that he was able to pursue those, led to the societal change that we have now, and that was useful.
Yeah, there's almost two parts to it. There's the feeling differently about the world, and I like the way you framed it, because the genius is fundamentally in feeling differently about the world. So it will often come about through a fairly unorthodox series of experiences or upbringing. And then your ability to somehow connect that back into society, which is often overlooked. So I'm not particularly a big fan of Steve Jobs. Certainly don't idolize him, but he's often held up as a good example, perhaps a good example of that, which is he did feel very differently about technology. And one thing, whether it was his own idea or he got it more likely from somebody else, was this idea that rather than thinking about the functionality, we should think about people's experience and ultimately their sentimental experience. That's why I have a blooming iPhone, because of how it feels. I like it. I'm attached to it. And that trumps functionality. And nobody else could understand that at the time. Wozniak could not understand that. But the beauty of that was not merely that he had that inclination, that insight, that feeling, because I'm sure other people did too, but that somehow he was able to translate that into reality. And the sad fact is that a lot of people who have those different feelings about the world, Van Gogh, I think, is an obvious example, didn't find a way to kind of connect those. And so that way that they felt was only recognized by other people many, many years later. And so it's quite rare that those two things are aligned, that they actually kind of come together.
I'll say with Nietzsche as well, of course.
It's hilarious. I mean, the comedy in his life is like he couldn't.
It's a rough story. It's a really rough story.
And he couldn't sell his books, and he thought. I mean, at some point he must have. I hope he laughed at himself, because he couldn't. He wrote these sort of profound books, and nobody was reading them. What did you expect? And then the suggestion that perhaps he hadn't quite worked this through in his mind was I think supported by the fact that he took over production, as you probably know, printing and production of some of his books at one point. It's like, why is nobody buying these books? They're genius. It must be because you're doing a terrible job as a publisher. I'll do it myself. And then it was only like friends and family, and it must have twigged at some point. It's like, and then it's untimely meditations. It's like, oh, okay, maybe we're not really ready to have this conversation. But equally, I mean, the way that he talked about things, he didn't really connect it terribly well. That was his whole, you've got to come down off the mountain and the marketplace and whatever. But
no, I mean, it's hard enough to sell a dethroning of Plato these days. Back when he is. Yeah. So no, it's an interesting thought experiment.
He should have gone TikTok. I mean,
it was interesting. Would he have been good on TikTok? Would he have been edgy, or would he have gone down a totally different route and stopped exploring philosophy because he, maybe he was an underappreciated dancer. You never know. You could have could have had a different pursuit.
Yes.
But I think laden within your idea of if we let people pursue what they have, you would potentially not get people like Nietzsche because perhaps they have some other interest they were able to pursue, but then you would get other people who would actually get into that zone, but perhaps led more by joy than painful necessity.
Yeah.
So
I think so.
We'll probably even out.
Yeah.
Because people, I think one thing the internet's shown us is that people get enthusiastic about anything. That people, and even if 0.001% of the population is interested, that's hundreds of thousands of people. That's so many people that are interested in that. Yeah. So, which is exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited about Steve the Fish at the moment. Have you seen Steve the Fish?
Steve,
I'm going to say
Steve the Fish.
Steve Le Poisson.
Le Poisson. I didn't know he was French. My apologies.
How could you not know this about Steve? What we know about Steve is he is orange. He has les bras. He has arms and he has legs. And he's a fish.
Is this a TikTok account?
I'm sending you the TikTok, whether you want it or not.
No, I'll take it. I'll happily look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have last couple of questions, if I may. Thank you so much for indulging. I think you had a video once which I really liked, where you said that there was a change in your life where you said, "My work is centered around experience design," and I then asked myself, if I was designing an experience for my life, would I have designed this? No, and then I made a change. Was that just a moment walking home? Firstly, is that an accurate retelling of that story? But secondly, was that just like a random moment that precipitated that realization, or how did that come about?
Yeah, it was a kind of humbling experience. Also humorous in parts. So it's a real thing, and so I'll tell that story, which is you work your way. If you're a kind of sort of quite high performer, you get this idea that you should work your way up the ladder. And I was very much from that Gen X, where that's it. You become a leader and a senior leader. Blah blah blah. Yeah. So I worked my way. Yeah, super manager, all the way up to. And they don't tell you that these jobs suck. So I got a job as the chief learning officer for Deloitte. One of the big four. Yeah. And you get paid quite a lot of money, and big glass and steel office. In London.
Not too shabby.
And you think, this is it. I've made it. I'm important.
I can now be happy.
Yeah. And I joined the day before the pandemic. So I found myself it's like Mr. Bean moment.
You joined the day before the pandemic?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Literally the day before lockdown.
Wow. And what a start.
So I went in to collect my badge on the day in which every single other person at Deloitte had been sent home so I sat on my own, and it was like a comedy movie. It's like, this is life's way of telling you how insignificant you are. Sat on my own in my new shoes, my big job, my badge in this office. It's like the infinite perspective machine out of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, thinking, this is weird. And then we had the pandemic, and I found myself sitting at home. And although I had this important job, and a big part of that job, as you say, was I was designing things like onboarding experiences. When you join an organization, I was really passionate about making that a great experience for people. We did some really good and award-winning work around making that a much better experience, and I cared about that, and I still do, and I still do a lot of that kind of work. And I did similarly with leadership. It's like, how can we make leaders great leaders? Because if you have a crap leader, your day is miserable. And so we design these experiences that take people through sometimes like weeks and weeks of wild and wonderful experiences. Sometimes like something really strange happens in a room. And I love doing that kind of work. And then I thought, but look at my life. As I'm sat in this room doing an average of 13 Zoom calls a day, like I'm in a contact center. And I hate this. I hate everything about this feels wrong. And it's not, I don't care if it's important. It's not the experience that I would have designed for myself. And it's like, how can I be this age telling myself that I'm successful and, I know all about experience design and have ended up here? So I think for me, plus also meeting my wife, frankly, was like a turning point in my self-perception and a realization that, no, I'm not going to wait until I'm retired to do something that, feels memorable. I need to design my own experience, and I need to make it much more adventurous and encounter difference more than I was. Yeah.
Something I probably should ask before asking that question, but on the unexplored area, from a popper perspective, what evidence could be provided that would falsify the thought emotion paradigm? Because it strikes me that the way to disprove it would be to say, well, I can have a thought without a somatic or qualia experience, but really, wouldn't all that prove is just that?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So I did anticipate that objection, and I did provide a couple of examples in the book. One of which is they're very simple ways to test, to put the theory to the test. And one of them I suggested was, well, you could kind of repeat something a little bit like Ebbinghaus's experiment, where you give people a list of words, some of which...
Oh yeah, you have the gun.
Some of which are emotively charged, and you can. How do you know emotively? Well, you can do that independently. You can get around a group of people and say, "Can you rate these in 1 to 10, and how much of an emotional reaction?" So you can do that independently, and then you can mix them up, get people in a room, and your theory, if affective context is correct, is firstly those ones which are on average more emotionally charged will be more likely to be remembered, and then you could go a step further, and you could say that words which have some relation to you, so if you work in construction, then I don't know, concrete or bricks or whatever, more likely to be remembered, and you could test that as well. And then of course the scientific retort to that is, but you could explain that in other ways, which of course you could, but here we have a theory which is an explanatory framework for a whole series of phenomena.
Makes predictions.
So it's put it to the test at least. So yes, I think it's quite easy to come up with ways in which you could falsify it, but nobody's doing that yet.
Yeah.
So
well, maybe surely after this, with my millions of listeners, that'll happen. But also, I mean, that also explains a bunch of other stuff, right? How pro chess players, I'm sure you know, maybe even this in your book, and I'm quoting you, but when shown boards where pieces are arranged in such a way as they've come from a match, they'll have a much better memory than if the pieces were just arranged randomly. And lo and behold, it's because it's relevant to what they do in their pursuit. That's crazy.
That was from Jonah Leary's work. He wrote a couple of brilliant books, one of which was called The Decisive Moment, and which basically, he was a Rhodes Scholar, science writer, and I met him during my time at BP. He got wrong-footed he was working too hard, burning the candles at both ends, and he misquoted or confabulated Bob Dylan lyrics in one of his books, and somebody tracked this down, and it became this huge hoo-ha about, how could he possibly have... Nowadays it seems like that's just the norm, is that people make up a whole load of ridiculous nonsense, but at that time that was like a black mark, and I always felt like it was a great shame, because I think he was very much on the verge of just dramatically shifting kind of perceptions, of how we understand decision making. So he looked at chess players, and a lot of grandmasters, effectively, it's a system one, if you like, process. It's an instinctive process. They're not doing what computers are. They're not going through. But he also looked at the stock market, and how people win by making instinctive calls. And the interesting thing about his work, he was then the subject of a book called "So You've Been Shamed." Have you come across it?
You've been publicly shamed, or just
something like
John Ronson?
John Ronson. Yeah. And so he tells that story of Jonah, and what happened to him in his career and so on. So that's part of my story now, I guess.
Last question, if I may. You and I both made videos around, say, masculinity, young men, societal trends, and all that sort of stuff. And I think we both share concerns around misogyny and sexism, and the proliferation of societally damaging content from Tate and others. Maybe this is an odd question, but it strikes me that from the affective context model, one reason maybe why we can't simply combat these bad ideas with arguments is because what lends itself to more potent affects is just time spent with someone. I sometimes think about, when I try and talk to more leftist friends who haven't listened to Joe Rogan like I have, is I try and say, listen, and I'm not saying Joe, I have complex feelings, and Joe Rogan, I think recently has a lot to answer for. But these Americans and these young men, whether they're truckers, whether they're working, they will listen for 3 hours at a time to Joe Rogan. They spend time, they know him. It's a parasocial thing. And if you do that hundreds of times, it's like a real person in terms of the sentimentality. And so, and almost inevitably, because we're spongy, we get affected by the values and views of those around us. And I think even as you say as your book, if your hero likes something, you'll start liking it too, because one care builds upon another. From this, then, should we say that, from the affective context model, one of the ways to instill better values is almost just through, for lack of a better phrase, just bombardment, just through building up airtime? Is that the sort of the old propaganda tool of just have better ideas, saturate the internet with good ideas, with truth? Is that part of the way of doing it, just purely because time spent with someone is going to make them care more? It's not even about winning the argument. That's a very clunky way of phrasing that question, but hopefully you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, you're right, and it's such an important point, because it's such a big issue. And I follow people like Destiny. I don't know if
Steve Bennell.
Who is almost like the exemplifies kind of rationality. But it's a limitation of the left. The left don't get, basically, that because they love reason and facts and arguments, that this is not generally how people work, because they've fallen in love with the idea that they are reasonable, other people should be reasonable. And I think you mentioned Dr. House, where he has this, or the script writers have this phrase which I love, which is, if you could reason with religious people, there would be no religious people. And it summarizes something which is, that is not how people change their opinions. It's like people change, and this is why the left is constantly frustrated by the ineffectiveness of what we're doing now, which is, we're talking to ourselves in a way. We're talking about the reasonable people, because if you don't care, if you don't value that kind of discourse or that kind of person, if you don't look at somebody and they're bench pressing a certain amount, or they're a football player, and think, I like that person, I identify with that person, that's why people are persuaded effectively. That's why a teacher at school needs to be somebody you feel cares about you or inspires you, because that's what does the work.
Then you're going to give a shit.
And you just look at them and think, this is some, whatever, left-leaning, blue-haired, so-and-so. I don't identify with that person, and none of what they say is going to matter. And I'll tell you a story, which is, I think, a lovely example of what you're describing. I had a Danish guy in my team at BP, and we were trying to do something radical with digital, and the legal team were basically just pushing back, and he kept sending emails saying, here's a justification why I want to do it, here's the reasoning, whatever. And he was getting super frustrated, and then he went out for a beer with this guy in the evening, and the next day he got an email that said, it'll be fine, off you go. So and he said I was outraged by this. He didn't enjoy basking in the success. He was like, it shouldn't be
be this way,
And it's like, but it is. And this is what's so dangerous about online, is as we spend less time together, as I say, and more times retreating. There's a book which summarizes the research around this called Grandstanding, the use and abuse of moral talk. And the basic phenomenon behind that is digital pushes people apart in terms of their opinions. If I wanted to persuade somebody who was, red pill, I have no illusions that making another damn TikTok about why this is stupid is going to influence them, because they don't identify with me. And effectively what I end up doing is I'm farming them. And this is the thing. I've seen people slip into this, which is to say, God doesn't exist, right? And they say this they provide a rational argument, and then they get a whole load of engagement around that. Much of it outrage from people who are not believers. And they think, oh, wow, that worked. I made money out of that. I'm going to do more of that. And it's very seductive, because before you know it, you are farming just these people. You're just making money out of outrage. And this is what the book kind of summarizes, which people will go for more and more outrageous content just because it gives them an emotional kick. And it's like, now we're just dividing. So you are absolutely right. You've either got to be the kind of person that person identifies with and admires, somebody who they idolize, and turn around and say, come on, this is not on.
Yeah.
This is not a good way to think. Or you, as you say, you've got to spend time with people, and that's happening less and less because it's the experiences which move people.
Yeah. No, completely. I want to write at length at some point around the temptation to make hot takes online, because now, as you say, there's not even even if you enjoy the attention, it's monetizable. There is a financial incentive. Some people's incomes are dependent on them doing this. And if you create a system like there is now increasingly where the subscriber model doesn't mean anything, if you have followers, it just means they're slightly more likely to see it. You now have to make it such that every video is going to be a hit. If that's how you're paying your mortgage, you can think, I can either try with a really nuanced take, or I can bait, and that's going to work, and that's bad for society.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think about, the same with you, I don't have any illusions when I make a long video that, I'm going to really fix the gender wars debate with this one. But I do sometimes think to myself of, why am I spending so long on this? Because maybe it's in part to because I come from that more leftist side of, I want to have sound arguments because that just makes me feel more comfortable in myself. But ultimately, the most useful thing to do would be long form, repeated stuff, totally nothing to do with these issues. Befriend these people, and then say, I really don't think that's the right way to seeing it. That's a much more effective than saying, I'm going to dismantle every possible argument, and therefore you'll have to agree with me. Yeah,
it is. You're right, and I guess the additional complexity of that is, and we've both, I guess, stumbled across this in what we've said. I probably stumbled. You probably thought it through, but why are we speaking on behalf of this kind of male advocacy? Why are we speaking on behalf of women? And the answer to that, in part, is because the increasingly men won't listen to women because they immediately. So sadly, they needed to hear what women are saying from the mouthpiece, of a man, which is already, kind of twisted.
Has problems,
and then that individual has to be somebody that they identify with in other ways in order for the message to get across. But the base problem behind that is that men are not in environments where they're able to listen to women, and that is the more problematic bit, which is that it's almost becoming increasingly segregated, because they're not spending time in environments where they can hear from women firsthand, and now instead it has to be mediated by this kind of digital dialogue. And I think that's similar to race. I think some of the most racist countries statistically are those where you don't have a lot of exposure to people from different cultures, and that provides the opportunity for those views to just not be countered, in a day-to-day way.
Well, they spiral. I mean, there's The Daily Show does a bit of this where prior to the election recently, they went to a long line of Trump supporters in a red state. And they said, what's the biggest issue for you this election? And everyone goes, immigration. And they say, great, who here has a personal story of their lives being affected by immigration? And inevitably, everyone goes silent. Yeah. And you go, what?
Yeah.
Where's that? What do you mean? Surely. And then someone will call up and they go, oh, no, this didn't happen to me, but I read about it online. And you think, this is just such an echo chamber. Sorry, one more on this.
Yeah.
Could someone say, so someone like Jake Paul or Logan Paul have become popular because of the attention of children watching their YouTube videos and all that sort of stuff, and you can say that the content that these individuals have made has been predatory, but ultimately it's been designed, and MrBeast as well, it's been designed to engage young people who have hours to spend online as far as possible, and now these people have become incredibly influential.
Yeah.
Could someone provocatively say, well, this is an example of allowing children and young people to follow their interests, and look, this is terrible, because now it means that the side effect is that they idolize these people who have, insofar as you can objectively judge values, you can't objectively judge values because you always have to use another value system, but most, let's say, well-conditioned adults would say that these are not good role models, and it also means that, say, what we probably would love is for a lot of young men to have some female role models, maybe their mother or an aunt, but also celebrities out there. But most 13 and 14-year-olds, because of male culture or whatever, aren't of their own volition going to go, I really look up to so and so, a celebrity or what have you, or this female tennis player, or Selena Gomez. So, is there an element of how do we square that circle? Sorry, again, terribly phrased question, but
yeah, I know what you're saying. I think it's an argument that I encountered way back at the BBC, where when Twitter came along, we naively thought there was a big debate about, is this good for news or not? And the more optimistic people thought, this is great because now we'll get perspectives, from around the world. It'd be much more inclusive and open and whatever. And it was almost like the exact opposite happened in a horrific way.
Yep.
And it's like, why? How could we have been so stupid? And I think back to this core problem that's happening to us globally is that culture is fragmenting, and it's getting to the point where, I use the expression dog, and I said, you and I both know what dog means because we've had similar experiences with dog. But what happens in a culture where nobody has the same experience of the world, because increasingly it's digital, and actually we're not often in shared spaces where we have shared things. And it's like we get to the point where we don't mean the same thing with our words. We're not speaking the same language. And I think this was the role that organizations like the BBC played, which is huge groups of people had the same perception of what was happening in the world and what mattered. And that was because some of the stuff they would tell you on the 9 o'clock news or whatever was stuff you didn't want to hear.
Yeah.
It wasn't just whatever you want to hear, we're going to tell you.
Yeah.
Now, what's increasingly happening, and I saw a thing talking about what Fox News did, where they got to the point where they sort of realized editorially that if they lied, they got more money, bluntly. And if they told the truth, it switched people off or whatever.
Yeah.
And because they're not publicly funded in the way that BBC was, there wasn't really an incentive for them to tell the truth. It was going to cost them. Yeah. And so journalists were, to varying degrees of embracing it, just knowingly saying things that they knew were complete bullshit, just because that's what makes the money. And that's, I think, the problem that you're pointing to, and I also feel as well. And I do think it's deeply troubling that commercial pressures basically just pander to whatever implicit desires people have kind of bubbling around. And so I think we're building these algorithms as this kind of vast machine to just surface almost like the basest instincts of people, and to build on them commercially, financially.
Yeah.
And I think,
it's the system problem.
Yeah.
Basically.
And it's about to get a hell of a lot worse as well. And so
but coming back to what you said earlier, is that part of educational reform would be introducing people to a wide range of interests, and that would presumably also include people. It would mean that you would showcase young people, AOC, or people like Kamala Harris, where you'd say, look, these are people who are not fully represented, like women aren't fully represented or as well represented in politics in most nations. So we're going to expose you to this because it's really important that. And because you're a human and we can idolize anyone of any gender, you will probably resonate with this. But in the current attention-driven economy we have, that's more of a riskier gambit. So that happens less frequently.
Yeah, your analysis is more delicate and sophisticated than mine. But to give a very crude correlate to a young man, to bring it back to your point, the choice is you can have this digital relationship with somebody who will say and do and feel and react in whatever way you like and look the way you like. But look, over here, this is a real woman, and spend some time with them, because this is what they really, think is important and what they really value, and this is what they really behave. And at least they're then in the position, to make that decision. Where currently, I think, for commercial reasons, as I say, they're just being weaned off reality. And I think ultimately it's not even commercial, it's technology. That's technology's agenda. The technology is weaning people off. It's making reality just so disgusting in a almost literal sense, in which, men no longer find, what was the thing where they found Margot Robbie mid? Why is that? Because you've exposed to so much digital fantasy that you can no longer bear the taste of reality.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is... deeply undermines any ability to connect with reality in a whole host of ways, with other people, with what's really going on politically, to empathize, if you like.
Completely. You also see that with male body standards, whereby if you look at Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, whereby Tobey Maguire, after he gets bitten by the spider, he wakes up and he flexes in the mirror. His physique at the time was considered, wow, that's a superhero. Whereas nowadays, compared to the things that men are exposed to online, that person would be called mid, probably a beginner, nothing else. I think we're going to need, or maybe as you say, it's inevitable because technology is using us, we're going to need more sophisticated apparatus to incline people to staying in reality. The character of, I think what's it called, Slifer in The Matrix, who sells the team out to get plugged back into the Matrix, and he says to Agent Smith, I want to be someone important. I know the stake isn't real, but it tastes good. I think more and more people are going to be essentially aligning with that and saying, hey, reality is this messy thing and it's going to be less pleasurable, but you should still opt for it. That's the case I think we're going to have to make more often.
Yes, I think sadly it's a losing case. To end on a complete...
That's why Matrix was fiction, because everyone would have wanted to be plugged back in. They would have sold Neo out in a heartbeat.
Because I think what you're battling at the end of the day is just homeostasis. You know, it's like I find myself saying various forms of you should opt for a harder life because that's how you grow and develop. And it's like, hands up. Who wants to grow vegetables in their back garden because, you know, it's not good for the planet to do this? Who wants to go back to, you know, walking places? Who wants to go back to using a map because you've eroded your capability by using sat nav? No, nobody's opting for that. Let's not kid ourselves. So it's like you and I mean, and I guess, and some people who've had the privilege of certain kinds of upbringings have then that latitude to say, well, you know, we're going to, you know, opt to do something a bit tough because that's going to stretch us. But for many people, they're just taking, especially in current climate, just taking the easiest route and will continue to take the easiest route because that fundamentally, as I say, is homeostasis and
evolution. It's nature.
So I don't think we're going to turn it around with our musings.
If I was a 13-year-old right now, I'd be using ChatGPT. It's so it would be so hard not to.
It's like don't use the calculator. Do it. You know, pen and paper. They just sound like old fogies, right?
Ultimately, then it's the to try to say something profound. It's the having a positive affect for effort is the thing that if you can cultivate that's going to be the change, or positive affect towards difficulty. If we can inject that into every human being, maybe we'd have a chance.
Embracing adversity, if we could,
it always comes back to this. So would you say that maybe Sisyphus was in a sense lucky because he was forced to roll up a boulder and we won't be forced to, and maybe that will be our demise?
Well, Sisyphus certainly got mad gains.
And on that note,
rolling it up. So I was in Boston. No, Austin, Texas, and it's a pretty
weird
featureless place. But we went down they built this little mini thing like Venice where you go on a little boat ride. This is all true, by the way. It's not some sort of hallucination I've had.
No, in Austin, anything that sounds like hallucination is probably true.
And there's a vast kind of metallic statue of Sisyphus rolling a ball up a hill for absolutely no reason that I can figure out. But
it's just out there.
Yeah, it's just out there. Yeah.
So, Nick, thank you so much for your time. For people who want to learn more about your work and writing, obviously there's your book, How People Learn, which can be found on Amazon and other stores. Where else should people find out more about you and your work and your thinking? TikTok.
Where? I'm a public nuisance, basically. Yeah, I'm on TikTok. I'm on. If you really
where would you like to direct people to go? Yeah.
I mean, they're just outbursts.
I'll put it. That's all we can do. Yeah, it's all I'm doing. I'll put it in the description. But if you would like to direct people,
I think I gave up on Twitter. But I'm on, and I do. So I do different things on different things.
Please.
But I do more kind of outbursts on TikTok, and then more super boring stuff on the learning and training stuff on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we didn't talk about 5DI. My bad. Maybe next time. But we got too caught up with Nietzsche and everything else.
Yeah.
Cool. TikTok, LinkedIn.
Great.
I'll put that in the description. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool.
Great.